All right. Also in here, you'll find all the slides. Also in here, you will find all the entire video recording, right? Oh, wow, I think we hit the limit of Zoom. This is sad and not sad at the same time. That's incredible. So that you can find and download all the slides if you want to, right? And follow along with it. This is also where the video would probably be put from like 2-3 hours after the workshop ends, right? Also, sure, I think we can duplicate it just in case, but I'm going to bring it up anyway later, right? And the questions thing and stuff like that. Also, you'll find that there is a lot of links, right? Hopefully useful links. It's the point is not to go for all these links today, right? But you will see a lot of topics, and if you think that you want to kind of refer to them throughout, your conversations about accessibility later or something similar, you can go ahead and use them, of course. Again, maybe just to make sure, I'm just going to create a copy, just in case you cannot reach the other one right here. So hopefully this will help. And please distribute yourself between the two. We were just not expecting so many people, to be honest. All right, so here we go. Smash.by Design Patterns 2025. So that's going to stay, no need to copy paste. All right, and so if you have any questions, ideally, because they're probably going to disappear in chat very quickly, drop them in one of these collaborative notes, and there will be time for us to bring up questions and to discuss questions and everything. And hello, wonderful people on the chat in YouTube as well. All right, ready to start, everyone? This is just a bit of a homework here to keep in mind. Yes, so let's go. Now, when we look into inclusive design, I think in many ways we have this misconception about what it means and who it's for and how to use it. And I want to kind of break it down. I think I want to do it through the perspective of people's experiences. Because very often we perceive this accessibility as a very technical term, but in reality, it's actually way more than that. It's much more difficult than that. And I want to look in this couple of chapters, like 6 chapters to be specific, right? We're going to look into European Accessibility Act. We're going to look into WCAG 2.2 and everything new that comes with it. We also will be looking into color blindness and motion sickness and how to deal with them. We'll be looking how to design for children, how to design for older adults. And then we'll be diving into neurodiversity when we explore autism, dyscalculia, deafness, blindness, screen readers, things like that. And in the end, we'll conclude by figuring out how to make a strong case for accessibility if you happen to be in a company, organization, which maybe doesn't value it enough or doesn't feel like it deserves the attention that you believe it actually deserves, right? But just before we do that, right, and before we go into all the fine details, I think it's very important for us to have a very clear understanding about accessibility and inclusive design in the first place. And I mean, it's really rare to find people who are very, very excited about accessibility in companies on a business level. And I always ask myself, why is that? It's not for the lack of empathy. It's not because they're bad people or whatever. It's just very often the needs, the accessibility is seen as so far away from business does every day. And we need to change that. And I want to change that today because it's really something that we can, I believe strongly, we can change. But we need to do some prep work for that. And specifically, we need to look into what accessibility means, what inclusive design means, and how do we deal with both. Most importantly, one thing that I think all agree at this point, everybody who is sitting in this room, right, that accessibility is not a checklist. It's not just taking up a WCAG and then saying, well, okay, what kind of checkboxes do we need to complete and just mark those checkboxes? It's not about that, because accessibility represents an experience. And to me, accessibility is a part of user experience. It's just how the website is experienced, right? And in fact, accessibility on its own is basically an effort that we as designers, as developers, as engineers, as creators, as marketeers, as anybody, right? Content publishers, whatever. It's an effort that we try to keep a digital experience meaningful and usable for as many people as possible. And I'm always terrified. I mean, frankly, terrified when I hear people speaking about, accessibility being an edge case or accessibility being, for edge case users. And sometimes speaking about average users. To me, in my book, there are no average users. There is no average user. It doesn't exist. And now, if I think about it deeply, and I mean, sorry, I might be grumpy today. I just had only 4 coffees today. So that might be my story here. But I always feel like when I think about average users, we kind of normalize or average all these wonderful experiences that different people have across our product to something that's more or less standard. And that standard doesn't necessarily represent reality. It doesn't represent, average experience that we get. It doesn't exist because everybody's in a continuum in everything. Everybody is extremely unique in many different ways. So we kind of need to respect that and kind of not dismiss some people as, edge cases or some situations as edge cases, because every now and again, everybody will be going through some edge cases, if you like. And I always remind myself of this wonderful quote by Scott Gell, who is a front-end engineer and just a very, very kind person, who said once that accessibility is not something that we need to add to a website, right? But something we start with initially and risk losing with every single change. And our task as designers and engineers is to retain it rather than actually build it in, right? And I like that because when we start thinking about accessibility from the early on in design process, in development process, this is where we just have it. We just don't lose it because every single time you kind of add something to the website, to the product, you kind of risk losing it if you're not careful enough. When we look around though, like how do people see accessibility, inclusive design, and so on, you see that this is a very common understanding. And this is also how I would say many businesses perceive accessibility and inclusive design, right? Accessible design very often thought of as a technical implementation related skill or kind of work that needs to meet needs of people with disabilities. It's disability work. This is how it's sometimes coined. On the other hand, when we look into inclusive design, right, we think about considering the full range of human diversity and address all needs that kind of go way beyond just technical kind of disability. Because again, when you think about technical disability sounds weird, but what I mean by that is that when we think about a person in its very different forms and shapes and colors and flavors and whatever you want to think of it, this is where we kind of want to include everyone in a product and in the process as well as we're designing and building that product ideally as well. And then there is this notion of universal design, which is kind of usable by all and no adaptation needed. Like sometimes you could say, well, we would have one version for this group of people, one version for that kind of people. We kind of moved away from that. We rarely do that. I would say sometimes you have very distinct roles, like maybe individuals and companies trying to access the site that might make sense. But most of the time, we're kind of moving towards this universal design, right? And I really, really want to emphasize that very often, I think we kind of struggle by explaining what accessibility and inclusive design means. And I do apologize for going so much into detail now, but we need to really change one little thing. We need to change the way of how we speak about accessibility in the business room. Because when you compare the language that is used by business and the language that we use as designers and accessibility advocates, these are very different languages, very, very different languages. And there is no wonder that we are often not understood or misunderstood. And when I look at it, right, you walk in a room and then you hear people speaking about conquer the market and capturing the mind share and targeting customers, destroying the competition, fighting for market share, converting people, following up on them. Why would you convert a person? Just let them be for a moment, right? And also employing a sales force, hiring headhunters, picking battles, attracting eyeballs, getting people hooked, increasing lifetime value. Every time I hear these terms, it's so weird. It just sounds really war-alike, fight-alike, aggressive wording right there. Why is it like that? Every time you walk in the room, why do we need to fight all the time, right? And frankly, when I hear lifetime value, always, and I keep repeating this all the time, I always think about, we need to just go ahead and just try to find people and then draw as much blood from these people as possible during the lifetime. This is not friendly by any means, and this is just not fair. And of course, it's not always like that. And I think that there is also a notion that we said that Jessica is saying that it's very binary thinking. Yes, I think it's not always like that. But this is, of course, a little bit of exaggeration right here. But every now and again, when we speak, right, these are the terms that we hear. And I don't speak like that. I think that most of you don't speak like that, right? But when we walk in that room, when we speak about accessibility and UX, we think about reducing friction. Think about improving consistency. We think about empowering users and enabling and helping them. And this is very much the opposite of what we see on the left, right? We think about customer service and also something like developing empathy A lot of people I've been working with have just no understanding at all about what developing empathy even means. You either have empathy for something or you don't. What do you mean developing empathy? And so why am I kind of focusing on this now? Well, because whenever I walk in that room, I can't speak like this. This is just not me. But I would be very careful and very strategic to not speak like this either when I'm speaking about accessibility. And the language that I'm employing most of the time would be kind of trying to connect the business goal with the accessibility goals that we have in mind. For example, surely enough, if we can bring more people to use a product, right, it will have a business value. So I will be speaking about increasing a particular user base, right? I'll be speaking about improving filters by refining them, doing, I don't know, some sort of like accessibility work or UX work in general to increase the usage of filters, which eventually will help people to get to a better selection of, washing machines or whatever faster, right? So I'm not speaking business language, but I'm not speaking our internal UX language either. And that helped me. That really helped me to kind of move away from this almost wrong perception about what accessibility means in the first place. And what I always show, and I mean, I really want to emphasize that what I always show in that meeting, right, is this little view. This is a wonderful work that's been done by Booking.com team. And it's based on Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit, right? Where they're basically mapping the different sort of situations in which people happen to be, right? On the top, we have permanent, temporary, situational, and disabilities, right? In this case, when we're looking across touch, seeing, hearing, but also if we keep going here, speaking and thinking, right? But they also are mapped against a specific purpose of the business or the role or the value for the business. So in the case of Booking.com, we need to kind of map out how does it relate? How does touch relate to Booking.com? Well, we need to think about experience of an accessible flight. What about seeing? Well, maybe the driver is distracted. How about hearing? Well, maybe you're at a noisy train station, right? What about speaking? Well, maybe you're in a new country, you maybe don't speak the language well, and you have a different language that you understand, right? And also thinking, well, you might be stressed about canceled flights, so you cannot really thinking clearly. I love this framework of really adapting this Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit that many of you might have seen already towards the specific needs of a specific product in place. And of course, when we're looking here, like these 3 dimensions, this is something that is really easy for everybody to understand. So when I come in that room and when I speak about accessibility, the first thing I'm trying to explain that we often think about accessibility as being a permanent condition, but it can be temporary. It can be situational. You might be having one arm, but you also might have an arm injury, right, which is temporary. And you might be a new parent, which is situational, so you cannot, type with both keys at the same time. And that just makes accessibility more accessible, if you like, to people who happen to be not even caring that much about accessibility initially. And then there is something else. And I absolutely love this wonderful article by Eric Bailey in which he said that he actually was speaking and writing about accessibility preference settings. And I mean, you will see why I'm talking about all of this in a moment, right? He was speaking about accessibility preference settings. And what he wrote is people don't think of themselves as disabled. So they don't think the accessibility features apply to them. In fact, people often don't realize that they rely on accessibility all the time. And a great example of that is glasses. The glasses that many of you have, the glasses that I have. If you have somebody in that business room who has glasses, that's assistive technology in use right away. Whenever you're using Zoom, magnification, whatever, anything like that, this is accessibility features as well. But people don't think about them because they think about accessibility being a feature for disability, right? And also, just one thing to keep in mind, again, at this point, that there is no one true way to use a computer. Everybody is right in some way or the other. It's just the mental model that we are applying is not meshed by the computer, by the product, by the software. And whatever the kind of the use case is, there are limitations and barriers that we all need to contend with. Some of them affect everyone because of permanent disabilities. Others are present circumstantially every now and again. Does make sense, everyone. I know it's very abstract and broad, but oh my, I wish somebody had told me this, I don't know, many, many, many years ago, because I often felt misunderstood. And please maybe write a plus in the chat if you feel like whenever you're speaking about accessibility in your company or organization, you feel maybe blocked or misunderstood or ignored or dismissed or something along the lines. This was the story of my life. for many years. And I think that the reason for that is that we're actually speaking a very different language. So what do we do with that? Well, today, when I walk in and when we speak about those things, there is a very clear distinction. Accessible design is for equal access for people with disabilities, which is why when we speak about today about inclusive design, we speak about a little bit more than that, right? We speak about meeting the needs of diverse users in terms of age, gender, culture, mental state, abilities, and also disabilities, right? And then there is universal design, which basically aims to create a solution that works for everyone. In fact, one of my projects, oh, hello, by the way, I haven't introduced myself. Hello, my name is Vitaly. And I think for the last 2.5 years, I've been working with the European Parliament. And then for the last 8 years or so, I've been working with different clients, small and large. And one of the tasks that I had was to transform good old-fashioned tax forms and insurance forms and stuff like that from PDFs into universally accessible or universal form digital journeys, right? That was really difficult because I had to work across different languages and so on. And I probably will show some parts of that today as well. And I just want to emphasize, right, that again, I'm really very allergic to the notion of average users and edge cases because everybody has their own unique way of thinking, right? And people are unique, right? It just everybody happens to be on a spectrum. All right. So let's see what we can do with it. Now, and I'll be speaking a little bit more about like how to build a strong case about accessibility later in the end, probably around 2.5 hours from now. But this sets the foundation at which we're looking at. And also, just to make it very clear, better accessibility is better for everything. For people with temporary disabilities, permanent disabilities, and everything else. It's just better for everyone. And this brought us to this interesting world where we actually have now regulation that actually regulates, right, how accessible a product should be. And one of those things that really was life-changing for many product teams was the notion of European Union Accessibility Act that has passed, and also WCAG 2.2 and the relationship between them. So many of you might be here because of this, because there is a deadline, and the deadline is June 28, 2025, when we have to make sure that our digital products comply with European Accessibility Act regulations, which means that it's not just if you're a European company. This applies to every company around the world that serves European customers. On its own, European Accessibility Act is aiming to improve accessibility for people with disabilities, but also what they call functional limitations across the European Union, which means if you cannot use a product for one reason or the other, right, that's a limitation, that's a functional limitation that should be forbidden, right? And this is sort of a framework which sets minimal requirements, and it's important, minimal requirements. It can go beyond that if you want to, that all member states within the European Union must uphold, right? And again, the deadline for it to be implemented in every European Union state, but also in every digital product that leaves or serves customers within every European Union state is June 28, 2025. So what is European Accessibility Act? Well, great question. Now that's a new directive. Sorry about so many words over here. Just in case you want to take a screenshot, you actually can cover that over here. It's a new directive to standardize accessibility. It mandates accessibility for essential products. Now there is a statement or there is an explanation about what essential products are, right? But it's essentially, if you think about essential products, what we mean by that is anything that serves an end customer. So very often you will see this exception maybe, that you would see articles claiming that B2B is not affected by European Accessibility Act, right? Which is partially true, but not necessarily fully true from my understanding. Now, let me give you a bit of a background on that first. First of all, there are public products and there are public services that are affected by EEA. For public products, that would be any kind of devices. Think about ATM, cashier machines, or anything like that. Self-service kiosks, but also e-books, e-readers, anything like that. And then there are public services. These would be mostly us, where we're dealing with digital products, maybe banking, transport, shopping, e-commerce, stuff like that, right? And the EEA applies to all private companies globally that, again, serve European customers. Now, what does it mean actually exactly? Like, what are the restrictions and all? Well, first of all, if you have EU operations, you have an office within the European Union, and you have kind of a relationship with your customers, Your digital products must meet these requirements. There is a grace period that is often not mentioned. So for example, if you happen to be on a legacy product and you can't change that product for one reason or the other, and you don't keep updating or upgrading this product, then you have 5 years for that unaltered service provider or contract to be updated or upgraded. So you still will have 5 years beyond 2028. No, sorry, 2025, right? So that means you would have time until 2033, right? There is no clear reference to Web Content Accessibility Guidelines or WCAG, but we see that there is a strong implication for WCAG 2.2 AA compliance, not AAA compliance. In practice, it's very difficult to implement anyway, but AA compliance. And again, the deadline I already mentioned. So where does it come from? Well, there used to be WAD, which is a Web Accessibility Directive within the European Union, which served public sector. So EEA doesn't change much for the public sector because it was here already anyway. So if you're serving as a government or just a public service website or product, surely you will be for years now complying with this directive. And this directive refers to a specific standard, and that standard was EN 301549, which explicitly referenced Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as long as additional non-web requirements in there. Now, when we now look at the European Accessibility Act, you'll find that it actually references this very directive, WAD, and it says explicitly, this directive, the European Accessibility Act directive, should be aligned to the requirements of WAD, which is why we often speak about this directive, European Accessibility Act, referring inexplicitly to WCAG and referring it to the newest version of WCAG 2.2 on the level of AA. Right? This is where the connection is coming from. When you read this the actual directive, it's not very clear, at least not from the beginning, right? But once you start making sense, this is where we actually are. What does it mean then exactly, right? Again, sorry for so many words, but again, I just want to make sure that if you want to take a screenshot, you have it all on one slide. So the EAA applies to consumer interactions and transactions within the EU market. There are exceptions, B2B and employee-facing systems. So only employee-facing systems, but there is a big but that we need to keep in mind. And it's still not very clear how we're going to deal with it. If you happen to be working in a B2B sector and you have a company that's actually using or relying on your services, right? Or they rely on your services, right? Rather, well, if there is a person in the company that you're working with that has disabilities or that needs to be able to use it because it's a part of their work, but your product doesn't support them, then you might be not encouraged, but you will probably be, well, heavily, like really strictly encouraged to actually implement that feature to enable the person in the company that you're working with, right, to be able to use your software. So by default, it's not mandatory if it's just B2B, but if there is a customer, I don't know, employee who may not, for one reason or the other, cannot use your product because of your disability not being supported, right? Then you might be in a position where you would need to build it in, right? There is also another exception for micro enterprises, less than 10 people, with a turnover less than 2 million euros. There's also exception for archives, again, that are not updated after the effective date, and also for pre-recorded media, because again, you might not be in a position where you can add transcripts or subtitles to every video that has been published in the archive. But from now on, from 28th of June 2025, you will have to do that, right? And then there are a couple of other things. One notable thing that I really want to stress is that accessibility overlays are not accepted as is under the EAA. So if your company believes that they can just drop in accessibility overlay to be compliant, they would be wrong, right? From EAA, it's very clear that accessibility overlays are not accepted as is. So it might be that if you worked on adjusting it or improving it or building on top of that, maybe, but that's not a given, right? And also on the other hand, if you're working with other companies that that you need to rely on, again, especially in B2B, where you rely on their products, well, it's your responsibility to do due diligence to request EAA compliance from them explicitly. By default, they don't have to inform you about being a EAA compliant. So it's your responsibility to actually track if it is, right? Does it make sense, everyone, so far? This is probably the most boring part of the entire session, but it's important to get out of it, right? Okay, so if you can write a plus, that would be fantastic. Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Oh, we still have 998 people. I think we lost 3 people. That's okay. All right. Okay. So one more thing to keep in mind here is that national authorities are responsible for carrying out regular compliance checks. Will they do it? Will they not do it? That we don't know, right? But you will probably have a conversation at one point here and there when it comes to specifically whether you comply with European Accessibility Act or not. It's just a question of time. If you need more detail on that and all the reason, rationale behind it, with all the technical details, I highly encourage you to take a look at this wonderful talk, webinar by DQ on WAD and EAA Explained on YouTube. It's, I think, like around 1 hour. It goes into all the fine technical details because, again, of course, I'm not a lawyer, so I shouldn't be giving you legal advice at this point. Right? But you can find all the fine details about that over there. Right? Okay, so the European Accessibility Act references WCAG. And with WCAG, of course, just for us to keep in mind, we have a big overview of the different success criteria that we actually are broken down across different groups, right? Because perceivable, operable, robust, and understandable that we need to comply with. Many of them are quite self-explanatory. Some of them are not. I want to focus maybe just on a few new ones that are quite important, right? And I actually do have a comparison of that. If you actually dive into this example by Intopia, Yoram, you'll find a comparison between 2.2 and 2.1 right there. So it's a very good question, and wonderful to see you here as well, by the way, right? And also, again, just to be very clear, I just want to focus on a few things that are really often forgotten. These are the new things in WCAG 2.2. We're talking about focus not obscured, focus appearance, dragging movements, target size, consistent help, redundant entry, and accessible authentication, right? Of course, again, when we're looking at AA, this will be required by EAA for sure. Now, when we look at the focus not obscured, we're talking about relatively simple things. So if you have, let's say, experience like this, where you go through the page and then your focus is being obscured, that again is not compliant, right? That's kind of an issue right there. We can, of course, fix it, and that's actually relatively easy to fix with a bit of CSS right here. And again, but this is not necessarily kind of a session all around CSS, but it's relatively easy to do. If you know that we have a particular area like a cookie banner, we just need to make sure that we actually include scroll padding right there, so the focus is always in view. Right? This is how easy it can be. There is nothing magical over here, right? However, the way more difficult part that many teams are struggling with at this point is dragging movements. Because dragging movements refers, of course, to drag and drop, but it also refers to resizing. It also refers to reshuffling cards. It refers to pretty much anything that requires some sort of movement, right? Which you need to be able to act on or drag, which is really challenging. Like most libraries out of the box don't provide this sort of functionality to enable people to drag items with keyboard only, right? Which means in your product, if you have anything that requires kind of a mouse dragging movement, right? You need to be able to, as a user, to enter in the movement or dragging mode, use the keyboard to navigate up and right and left and bottom, and then let it be by resting it, letting it sit, right, with space and escape keys. We'll speak about drag and drop in a moment, but that would be also kind of an important part. And then finally, also authentication, right? Because again, for authentication to be accessible, we cannot rely on identifying fire hydrants and captchas, right? That's definitely out of the question. And many of you might have heard about passkeys, right? And ideally, passkeys would be pretty much the future that we're looking at. Just in case you haven't heard of passkeys, that's a future I'm real hopeful for. Right here, it's also well supported across all devices. Basically, the idea being that we would not need passwords anymore at all, and instead we'll be relying on touch or scan or in the worst case maybe magic sign-in, right? But this is really, really nice to see this kind of evolution happening. The passkeys are indeed the future, right? And so with WCAG, I think that most of the teams are really struggling with dragging movements. The other things are a little bit relatively straightforward. When we're looking into target size, they're just going to be adjusted a little, right? There is nothing kind of groundbreaking over there. If you're looking for all the fine details of that, these are all of them again on one slide. We shouldn't be obscuring a focused element, for example, with sticky headers and models. The focus should always be visible, at least partially for AA. We could use a focus outline of 2 pixels with sufficient contrast if we want to be on AAA. Help is consistently presented and located across all pages. Then we have UI controls for dragging movements, for example, drag and drop resizing and stuff like that, reshuffling cards and so on. And then we also, for that to be working, we need to allow users to click and tap on an item, pick it up, and then move it with keyboard and then drop it. This is it. This is all you need to know, mostly about WCAG 2.2. In the Google Doc, you will find a lot of details around that goes into all the fine specifics about what to keep in mind there, right? There is maybe just a few more things here to know, right? You want to not block copy-paste and avoid capture any cognitive puzzles. In terms of authentication, simple authentication, that'd be very, very challenging to implement, right? Have you ever heard the audio version of the capture? It's something else. It's really unbelievable. It's really, really hard to decipher what the hell is going on there. This also goes for object recognition. So if your authentication relies on it in some way, for spam bots and so on, we have to kind of rethink it, but it's again on level of AAA. And the best thing you can do is 2-factor authentication, magic links, pass keys, and maybe fingerprint or Google Authenticator authentication, stuff like that, right? So there is that. And oh my, I'm so happy that eventually this, and with it, this good old friend, hopefully, will eventually become gone, especially with the world on passkeys. I'm very hopeful on that. All right, so that's kind of the technical part. All right, let me just drop in the questions here because it was like the first 46 slides out of, how many do we have? Right, 1,305. Good luck. We'll stay here for a while. I don't think we're going to go for all of them, but that's also not the point, of course. Down with captures, Danny. Absolutely. I can only agree with that. All right. So, wow. Oh, that's a lot of questions already here. So maybe I'm not sure where this is coming from. I'll probably need to remove this somehow. That's very strange. Right. Okay. So maybe I just double down on like EAA regulation, just 3 questions. What's the most appropriate certification to get certified for digital accessibility relevant to the new EAA regulation? Frankly, I really have no idea on that. The best thing you can do is to actually, study EAA on its own. It's difficult to read, but you can make sense of it. I would say that this is probably the best thing you can do. As of drag and drop, yes, I have it. I will come to this a little bit later today, where I'm going to show how to be compliant on that, right? Yes, sure. I'll be happy to upload this files later. I think that we have a lot of questions over here. So I'm probably going to kind of preserve the time in the end, probably 30, 40 minutes, to make sure that we actually cover as much as we can. All right. So everyone, now with this out of us, so for me, kind of the most exciting part really is not compliance. The most exciting part is what we can do with it. And I want to go into a lot of fine details now by diving into specific parts of the patterns, design patterns that we can apply to really make a difference in the world. Just one thing before I do that, I want to remind everyone that you can, because some of you attended a bit later maybe, that we have a Google Doc right here that you can use right away. You also will find a couple of things here, and I'm really bad at promotion. I'm really, really bad at this, but I'm just going to drop it in here. We also have a video course that we launched. So if you want to get like a friendly 15% off, here we go. I can actually just drop it in here. Feel free to use the code inclusive if you're interested, or just check it out, whatever. I'm really, really bad at this, but I was told I should do that. All right, moving on. Design patterns. And I want to kind of start with the things that we are probably familiar with, and that would be colorblindness. Colorblindness seems like, we've got that, right? We know red blindness, green blindness, stuff like that. So let's move on. No, it's actually way more complicated than that. So for the case of the European Parliament, working with a team where we actually try to figure out the most accessible and inclusive design language that we could be using for the big revamp of the European Parliament, right? We had to spend quite a bit of time thinking about how do we keep things accessible, like with a capital A, if you like, right? And that also brings us to the notion of colorblindness, because it's not as easy as it seems when you start diving into it. There are approximately 300 million people who have some kind of color weakness or are colorblind. There are two notions that we kind of keep in mind there. On the one hand, you might be colorblind, which means you have a problem or difficulty really perceiving colors. But on the other hand, you might have a color weakness, which means you can perceive colors, but you don't perceive them at a full strength. The safest bet that we can have as designers is to never rely on colors alone to communicate any kind of data, right? So this is what we've got. And if you look at it, and again, I'm pretty sure that some of us will have some color weakness or color blindness, you will see that there are differences between the normal vision, protanomaly, as it's called, deuteranomaly, as it's called, and tritanomaly, that it's called. This is red weakness, green weakness, blue weakness, and normal vision. When we look at red weakness, it affects only 1% of male, 0.02% of female, right? On the other hand, 5% of male, way more than that, are affected by green weakness and 0.4% of female. And then when we look at tritanomaly, which is blue weakness, this is actually quite rare. It's really rare to find it in general. This is why we often say that the only reliable color that you have, the only one reliable color is blue and shades of blue, right? But this is kind of, again, color weakness. I mean, some of you might see that there are differences between this one, which is what's considered to be a normal vision, and then red weakness, green weakness, and blue weakness. Specifically, when you look at red over here, right, it's perceived differently, right? It's red weakness, so you still can distinguish colors. That's important, but you don't see it at full strength. This is why it's called weakness right here. Then you have green weakness, which is kind of the same story here, but for green, right here. You might see the difference over here. But then you also have blue weakness, which again, the perception of blue, which is different, right? Which affects not that many people. It's worth noting, by the way, from what I was reading, and I might be wrong, but I would need to double check, that green weakness is inherited, but it's inherited only by men, right? So it means that if you have green weakness, it's very likely that your children will have green weakness as well. Men, right there. Yes, but I think that the person who is going to be affected are only mostly men, right? On the other hand, we have color blindness. With color blindness, it's different because we have protanopia, deuteranopia, and tritanopia. It's kind of this, they kind of have the same syllables right here, right? 1% of men have red blindness, 0.02% of women. 1% have green blindness, 0.01% of women. And then when you look at blue blindness, it's again 0.03%, right? It's a relatively small number, but it's still noticeable and it's still worth thinking of course. And so when we look at the blindness, again, it's not as widespread, I would say, as for green blindness as it is in the case of color weakness. Just to make it very clear, so if we look at something like this here, which you might consider to be, reasonably distinct, different colors being relatively distinct, 1% of men will see this like this, 1% of men will see it like this, right? This is a wonderful research done by Lisa Charlotte Muth, which goes into all the fine details of color blindness, and these examples are also from her wonderful article and series on that. Also, unsurprisingly, when we look at red and green, right, we'll see that it looks, of course, very different for people who actually have color blindness or color weakness. And I want us to really, because, I'm really kind of, maybe I'm just really didn't have like enough coffee today, but I always feel like we often think about it, all right, we're not going to use red and green together. That's just technical. No, I think it's important for us to be really putting ourselves in the shoes of people who are experiencing this every day. And I kind of try to bring in and read a lot of articles about how people with color blindness and color weakness go through life and what this, like color weakness and color blindness, actually means for them. And this is just a collection of all the different things that people are experiencing with when they go through life. And of course, if you happen to be colorblind or color weakness, have color weakness, please let me know if you write in the plus if it actually accommodates for you as well, if it kind of covers your needs as well. If you have a charger, which is just like a power charger that you take with you, right? Very often it's blinking red and green. So for a person who has color blindness, it's impossible to know when it's actually fully charged. As simple as that. My matching clothes is actually difficult. Differentiating between visited and non-visited links sometimes, depending on the colors, can be very hard. Also because when we look into blue and purple, as we grow older, purple looks much more like blue, or blue looks much more like purple. So that's something to keep in mind. Whenever you go climbing, right, and you have color-coded anything, color-coded holes or flags or something, that becomes a trouble right there. Something as simple as finding dropped piece on a carpet is a nightmare because you are green blind, right? Also, it's hard to see because you're red blind when the food is cooked, right? And also, when you see a lot of changes between red and green lights, it appears flashing all the time, right? Because again, if you change between red and green, it's the same color that's just flashing all the time. That also results in the fact that it's very difficult to read dashboards and charts. It's been surprising to me to see so many people actually saying that they usually don't think about color full stop. So whenever they wake up and they sit in front of the machine or so, and they have maybe something like a carpet or maybe a blanket in the back, very often they just don't think about color. They can't remember color. They just, if you ask them what color is that, or what's the shirt from a person who you're speaking to, they would never focus their attention on that, right? Also, some simple things like it's very hard to judge the ripeness of a fruit when you go to the supermarket, right? Anything that's color coded alone is a problem. And very often, because people realize that they either get colorblind over time, or it could be that they just grew up knowing that certain things are of a certain color. For example, if you ask a colorblind person what color is the bench in a wood, right? They would say brown, although they don't necessarily have a kind of a clear representation of what brown is, right? And the same goes also for like the traffic light, right? There is red, green. People would say that it's green, but it doesn't mean that they actually perceive it in that way, right? So this is just what living with color blindness is like. And of course, when we start looking around and we start applying this to our work, and I have to turn on lights at this point because it's getting dark. Just a second, everyone. All right, that's a bit better. Right? You will see that there is again a difference about what people see that goes way beyond red and green alone. So if you have, let's say, something like this, a combination like this here, right? What you will find is, well, this is what people with normal vision see, right? This is what people with normal vision see as well. The difference is here, it's kind of different shade and different color, but then becomes almost unusable for people who are red blind. It also becomes very difficult to decipher like which is which for people who are green blind. So it's not necessarily just, I mean, at this point, it's just shades of red and green, right? But that's really quite significant. So for red and green blind people, red and green might look like gray, right? On the other hand, also, again, as I mentioned, as we grow older, right, kind of, again, red purple looks very similar to like blue. And for red and green blind people, this is mostly always going to be the case. And so when we look around, you will find that there are a lot of shades which are just difficult to compare. For example, if we look again at red and green over here, right? The reason why we shouldn't be using it, because if you rely on color for people to make a decision, right, it's very difficult to decipher between these colors. Right? They have slightly different shade, but it's very, very hard. The same goes over here. They look remarkably similar.
The story across.
Oh, I think I had some noise coming in, right? And also kind of the same story over here, right? So if you have, let's say, blue, kind of different shades of blue and green, this is different, right? And it's only 1%, less than 1% of people who are affected by that, but they will have a very difficult time distinguishing between them, right? And of course, when you start going into deeper, you find a lot of different suggestions for colorblind safe palette. And many of them rely on specific colors. They try to not mix red and green, of course. But when we look at here, right, this is one of the palettes that is widely recommended. We'll find that, yes, well, the colors are different indeed. Like all of them are different, but they're still quite difficult to decipher. Like these ones, right, well, they are different, but they're also similar. These ones, well, they're also different, but they're similar, right? Kind of get in a slightly different situation over here, right? So what do we do with that? First, we need to be very careful when we combine hues and patterns. Patterns change how bright or dark colors are perceived. So ideally, what some designers tend to do, they design in grayscale first, and then they add color. Or they add shapes. This is coming from IBM Carbon Design System, where, and together with colors, they also try to think about maybe adding shapes or different textures to the data visualizations, right? In fact, what it would look like in the end would be something like this. Even something as simple as having an outline, like a white outline over here, makes it colors much more distinct. That already can make a difference. On the other hand, sometimes you find the shapes and textures right here that are kind of added in. I wouldn't say it necessarily helps people understand things faster. So maybe if you have so many different line charts, it might be a good idea to have just a list view or a table view and as assisting a person who maybe wants a slightly different view anyway. That might be helpful for everyone. That might be a good idea. Maybe something like this, right? Where you would have these outlines, white outlines to distinguish between the different chunks as well. And then you would maybe have a different view, like view as a data table, or enter chart where you can actually explore it and find details maybe as a list view or anything similar, right? So this kind of shapes, or sometimes even shapes toggle, we can say, I want to see shapes on my line charts or on my map or so, could also be helpful in that case, right? And I think I want to emphasize at this point that very often what we encounter are this sort of understanding that, well, to deal with color blindness, we just need to have a, like when we're speaking about accessibility, good contrast, like good high color contrast, right? And of course, WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also give us guidelines about what to keep in mind. This is pretty much the cheat sheet that you need to keep in mind for color contrast. But it doesn't necessarily refer explicitly to color blindness in any way. Right? Sure, we have some guidelines around what the contrast should be between the text and the background and the surroundings and buttons, and it differs for icons and UI elements and text, right? That's for sure. And if we want to stay above level, like at level AA as a minimum, but we're looking at 4.5 to 1 as a normal text of any size. When we look at large text, we're looking at 3 to 1. Then we'll look into bold text, also 3 to 1. Icons and graphs, 3 to 1 too. And then UI elements like a button, also 3 to 1, which also needs to respect the border, the context around it, the background at which this button sits, and stuff like that, right? So, but again, color contrast doesn't necessarily solve color blindness by any means at all. There is a lot of conversation right now that's happening around viridities. Viridities is one of the palettes, color palettes, that can be combined with this toggle for shapes, which looks like this, but there are many, many different flavors of that too, right? Which is one of the few color palettes that are perceived by a wide majority of the audience of people as the same. It doesn't only look like this though. I have to show you maybe a few other options here. Viridities color palette. So if we start looking, you'll find that there are very different flavors of it, if you like, very different color palettes, but they all circle around like yellowish and then purplish, right? Something along that, sometimes with slightly different shades and flavors, if you like. So if you're looking into it, get Viridity's color palette is probably the best thing you can do if you need to rely on colors, or if you need people to rely on colors a lot, for example, for data charts or something like that. Right? So this is one slide that combines all of that in one. Blue of all the hues is the safest hue for users to perceive the color the way you do. So if you want it to be perceived in exactly the same way by almost everybody on the planet, then blue is the safest hue. You can use pretty much any two colors, the exception maybe being red and green again, as long as they're very significantly by lightness. Colorblind users or color weak users can tell red and green apart. They just don't know which is which, right? Then colorblind safest palette is to mix blue with orange or red. This is something that you will find quite a bit. Ideally, we want to avoid the same lightness for all our colors. You see a lot of neutral colors used consistently. Like if you have something like this will create struggle for everyone, not just for people who happen to be color weak or colorblind, right? We should never mix red, green, and brown together. We should never mix pink, turquoise, and gray together. We should never mix purple and blue together, ideally. And we should never mix green and pink if we also use red and blue. And this is like all of this was a miracle to me. I always thought that this is just red and green. It gets way more complicated than that. We should always never mix green with orange, red, or blue of the same lightness. In fact, the same lightness is often becoming really, really quickly problematic. And when you start looking in more detail, right? Again, what you will find is that there are many options to create beautiful, accessible, colorblind friendly color palettes, right? which are also fully WCAG compliant. So if you go to accessible color palettes, this is the URL for you right there. This is a wonderful little generator that helps you to get there. You also find it, of course, in a Google Doc. It's fantastic. It's very simple. There's also this ongoing myth that you can never use neutral colors. They can never use something like this pastel colors, which is not true. You can still use them if you want to. This is, again, another example on a little Figma kit. There's around 60 pastel colors, fully accessible on the level of AAA, which you can rely on, right? So that's, again, another option for you to consider right there. Very helpful. And of course, if you want to dive into all the fine details of color blindness, you'll find this wonderful, and I cannot recommend it enough, a wonderful three-part series by Lisa Charlotte Muth on color blindness, where she also interviewed people who happen to be colorblind. She also looked into colorblind experiences, color weak experiences, and specifically focusing on how to design data visualization, better charts for people who happen to be colorblind. Right? There was a question from Subhan, do we slowly move away from just lightness towards something like APCA? Maybe. It's still very early days of WCAG 3, right? But in many ways, because of the dark yellow problem, we often experience this indeed. Just in case you're not aware, very often in design systems, we have an issue with yellow. The yellow is supposed to be accessible according to WCAG AA, right? But it's remarkably painful and very difficult to read. So you'll find this quite a bit. For example, something like this sort of buttons, if you want to have, say, the same sort of, well, shade, I guess, of a color to indicate different things for buttons, maybe, or things like that here, it's impossible to reuse it in the same way because the luminance for yellow would be just very different. That's really, really hard to design for. So very often we need to create extensions, well, exceptions, not extensions for that. Here's an example of that, what you could do. And sometimes you would see companies going to extent, to extremes, figuring out just what would be the right combination if we do use yellow, right? So there are situations where you might want more yellow, you might want less yellow, right? And every now and again, as we mentioned already, we want to have a contrast that's going to be above pre1 on non-textual contents like icons or large text like headings and stuff, and for smaller text 4.1, 4.5, right? That is always challenging. It's always really, really hard. So with that, I'm actually quite hopeful that we probably will be moving away from HSL, for example, to LCH anyway. All right, so there is that. All right, so that I think I have covered. I need to just keep going. All right, still with me, everyone? We're just 1 hour in. We just are 1 hour in. Well, I'll probably have a break in around 20, 25 minutes. I just want to make sure that I know that some people jump in, jump out. Don't worry. Don't worry, everyone. Everything is being recorded. If you need to leave, you will actually get access to the video recording anyway. If you jump in like 15 minutes ago, don't worry. You'll get access to the video whether you want it or not. Wait, that's not friendly. All right, let's keep going. All right, the other thing which is really surprising, and this is really remarkable, motion sickness is just really not respected so often. And I'm not necessarily speaking about parallax, although I have to admit, I strongly dislike parallax in all its forms and shapes and variants, right? If you can avoid parallax, please do that. But let's look at the data. When people experience a sensory conflict between what they see and what they feel, it's called, or it's kind of, they perceive motion sickness, right? It often causes motion sickness. So whenever you're driving in a bus, right, or in a public transport, or in the back of a car, and you're moving along, and then you want to check or answer an email, please write a plus in the chat if you ever experienced this motion sickness, just not being able to reply to an email or write a text message just because, things are moving and shaking all the time. My life all the time. You're my kind of people. Around 30 people are highly susceptible to this behavior, which is called the vestibular disorder, or also causing then in the end migraine. And that kind of emerges in a very simple scenario when the movement that we're expecting and the movement that we're experiencing are not the same. Let me give you an example. Okay, there's going to be a quiz afterwards. I'm going to show you a video, which is going to be like 30 seconds long. And I'm going to ask you what is actually not quite right there. Just a website. eventually, oh, I haven't started playing it. Hold on just a second. Here we go. So just a video with a slider on the left. Okay, maybe before I start playing it, hold on. Please write in the in the chat. How would you navigate it? It seems like a slider. It has numbers or carousel. Numbers over here. It has the dot over here. It has this line over here. Okay, I see scrolling. Scroll down, drag down. All right. Also, dear friends in the chat, please write in there. Okay, drag up and down, scrolling, dragging down, parallax. Well, I think that not even a single person pressing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, clicking on the lane. Well, I think that all of us would fail miserably here. Miserably. Okay, I really have to turn on the lights. I think it's very, very dark over here. No, it works very differently. It's maybe not at all what we were expecting. Well, why? Let's see. Oh, damn it. I see I'm really bad at this here. So when you enter it, there might be the need to just, let's just click on this drops here and there. What happens is, what you need to do is you can click as much as you like, nothing is going to happen. Click on the line, nothing is happening. You can try to drag, nothing is happening. Click on the numbers, nothing is going to happen. The only thing you need to do here is to swipe. You didn't get that? Wasn't it obvious right from the beginning, right? Indeed, it is a slider, right? And that's maybe a little bit confusing. You might say, oh, come on, give me a break. You're just finding some really sites and then just show it. Well, this is actually quite common. You'll find this over here as well. This is a Vincent van Gogh museum. And you have this scroll for more. And you would expect that you can swipe left and right. No, you have to scroll down and up to navigate it. And this is where this motion sickness actually comes into play. But now we have a mental model that doesn't match what people are expecting with what they're experiencing, we get into trouble. And that's usually not needed. And sometimes it's just getting extreme, like extreme. I do apologize now. I need to show you one thing, and I don't know why this exists, and it should not exist on the internet. But there is one specific example that is just not great. So please turn off the screen or walk away for a moment. This is not going to be nice. All right, ready? Well, now everybody wants to look, I think, right? Well, I'm going to show it, but please don't run away. And I don't know why we would do this. Why you would do this. Right, okay, I'm moving on. This is really, really horrible, right? And why would we create something like this? This is just shocking to so many people. This is unbelievable, right? So can we do better than this? Well, yes. One of the things that Apple has introduced recently is this, which is kind of an interesting way. I haven't tested it on my own here, right? But the idea being, as you're moving in a vehicle or in a bus, it kind of indicates to you with these little bubbles or dots where you're moving. And apparently, according to Apple at least, this has helped massively people to reduce migraine and reduce motion sickness, because now they have a mapping between what is happening with what's supposed to happen, right? So, if you have, let's say, something similar, or if you're experiencing motion sickness, I highly encourage you to turn it on to see if it actually helps you. I'm yet to try it out, but it's actually quite impressive to see that there is a lot of evolution in this space. But you can also do much simpler things than that, right? An example of that would be something like this, right? Where instead of using something like this sort of parallax or whatever, you just repeat components as they're happening as you scroll down, right? You just keep repeating it, just kind of unfolding the story, if you like, right here. So maybe that would be another way of doing it. Here's a simple way of really kind of telling a story without, again, relying on parallax, where you basically indicate, or maybe you could highlight as a person interacts with a particular element on a page of what is going on. And if we actually scroll down there, I didn't record it, right? What you will see is that this blob becomes a little panel on the top that you can interact with as you keep going, right? So it's almost like a mini navigation, no parallax needed either. Or you just make it a bit more respectful, like we do over here, right? What you see here, it's kind of a parallax, but it's not really a parallax. You scroll down, you do not break the promise of the mental model that users are thinking of. You tell a story, so you have this sticky element that changes and adjusts itself as you keep scrolling, right? But it's still, a storytelling experience. But it's not as obtrusive, I would say, as the previous example was. So if you want to design a better motion, it's simple. It really is. We respect the physics. We map the scrolling to what people are expecting, to the animations. We avoid flashing images in video, especially when people are reading. Whenever it comes to interactive features that require something like parallax or something similar, we might want to ask for consent before that happens to, to not confuse people, to not create sort of motion sickness. You can also provide controls for an individual elements of a story, like I saw previously, where you can collapse something that will move or change something, right, into a menu, and then people can interact with it. It might also be a good idea that whenever you have animated charts, to allow people to skip to the end, so they just don't see that animation, but they see the end result. Like, sometimes you see this charts, like presidential election or something, where you have a distribution in the parliament and these bricks are kind of building up as you scroll down. Allow people to skip to the end so they actually see the end result. We also need to listen to reduced motion media query if somebody set up reduced motion in the browser, and then provide alternative version for that. And also, again, avoiding flashes and bounces to 3x. I'm not sure where 3x is coming from. Probably research I've done a couple of years ago now. And in general, avoiding parallax scrolling, which is basically movements at different speeds. If anything, movements of the same speeds are probably going to be much better. Right? Everybody with me still so far? Right. I think that we're still here at, nobody has left yet. All right, fantastic. So with this, let's move on, because I think in the beginning, what I promised to you is to look into a lot of design patterns, right? And for design patterns, we kind of need to look at the specifics about what how we actually design for different groups of people. And that's kind of the crux of inclusive design. And for me, this is where really the magic happens. When I start looking at inclusive design, we kind of need to think about different groups and how we can respect their needs and how can we design better for them. One of the groups that rarely gets any attention at all is how to design better for children. Now, typically, children are considered to be any people who happen to be in the age of 3 to 12, right? But of course, when we look at it, there are significant differences in the applications that the children will be using, or games that children will be using in the age of 3 to 5, 5 to 7, 7 to 9, 9 to 11, 12. So usually you never look at more than 2 years span, right? But I mean, when we're talking about designing for children, and Greg, I'll be speaking about ADHD in a lot of detail after the break in the second part, right? So stay around. But with children, right, we need to be really focusing and zooming in on 2 years, not more than that. Of course, children tend to lose focus and motivation very quickly. They need steady achievements. The way of how we usually do it is by kind of this sort of motivation or rewarding them. But these rewards are very tricky, because if they're extrinsic motivation, then children are kind of relying very quickly from the early age then on getting reward from somewhere else. And that's not necessarily a good thing. We kind of want to design with intrinsic motivation. We'll kind of look into that in a moment. We still need to reward, and we still need to encourage small wins, right? And by the way, Dominica, you'll find the weird example on slide number 103 in the slides in the PDF, if you want to. All right. Okay, so when we look again designing for children, no problem, Dominic. When we think about designing for children, we often think about things like this, right? Again, this is kind of a range of 3 to 12, but we are looking at bright colors, playful, informal, maybe a bit of Comic Sans here and there, like playful typography, playful colors, color combinations, catchy color combinations, and so on. We also often think about maybe things like this as they grow older, maybe to play with something like mathematical puzzles or anything similar, but still very vivid and bright colors. But we rarely think about this, which is also an experience that many children get from very early ages, right? Which is, of course, YouTube at this point with shows and specific YouTube Kids, right? And of course, very often you will find that many of the websites that are designed for children look very different from what we're used to. But anybody had to design or was designing a website for children? Can you write a plus in the chat? Or an application, maybe? A few people, so please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm looking forward to see your insights right there. So you will find websites like this, right? Bright animations, a lot of characters, big buttons, big text, not much text, but big text. And you see Maybe video, maybe games, maybe icons, characters, music, animation, all of that, right? On the other hand, sometimes you see websites that are definitely designed for children, but maybe not look necessarily like this. So this is one from, I believe, was it, what was that? I don't forget, Kinder, right? And here you have this nice explorative website where you can ask questions and you can learn all like around the clouds and the rainbows and how it comes to be. And you see that there are different patterns here in use. You see this little, almost like this iOS bar with icons on the right, and you see this, again, big animations and buttons and maybe not that much text and auto playing videos and stuff like that, big buttons and everything like that. If we break it down, what we need to think of when we're designing for children is basically this. And I love this quote by Deb in her wonderful, wonderful book on designing for kids. Children communicate volumes by how they play, what they choose to play with, how long they choose to play with it, and when they decide to play with something else. And again, there are significant differences in terms of ages, right? So again, this is just one quick overview of everything we need to keep in mind about how the brain of a child is evolving over the years, right? At the age of 2, they develop a sense of self, but only few mental models. Around 2 or 3 years, they actually have very rough motor skills, but they know how to swipe and tap around the age of 3. Around the age of 6, they can focus for a longer period of time, right? By the age of 8, they can decode simple written language. At the age of 10, they start using keyboard and mouse, but typing is still difficult because you need fine motor skills and which are not yet developed between 8 and 10. And they cannot still think abstractly until the age of 12. And for example, why does it matter? Because if you have a promotion, it's very difficult at that age to distinguish between ads and real content. As you get close to 12, it becomes a bit easier, right? What's important about all of this though, right? That when we're designing, we're looking at specifically on 2-year range. And the first thing that, and it's so funny, when you observe and look into research, you'll find that the first thing that children learn is how to swipe, how to scroll, video controls, and home button. Swipe, scroll, video controls, and home button, right? They really excel at clicking on the home button. That's unbelievable. But we shouldn't forget that whenever we're designing for children, we need to provide age-appropriate content for the range that we're designing for. And of course, whenever we're designing for children, we never just design for children, because we always design for the worst audience ever, the most critical audience ever, that is parents. And when it comes to parents, we need parental controls for children. And oh my God, parents are going to be the first people who are going to break you entirely in your comment section if you get something wrong, right? Oh my, when it comes to users, parents are really, really, really difficult, and for good reasons. So whenever we're designing for children, we also design for parents. They're the most demanding users you can find. They have no mercy in reviews and ratings. Whenever we think about parental controls, we need to think about time limits, rules, access, and stuff like that. They also need safety guarantees, regulations, and certifications. And they also value reviews from teachers, educators, doctors, and parents, which means that typically, whenever you're looking into designing pretty much anything, you will be relying on what parents are saying, what teachers are saying, what educators are saying, what doctors are saying. There will be no customer testimonials necessarily, but there will be testimonials from those important figures. And also, parents are very much willing to pay for apps to avoid disrupting advertising, for sure, right? So when you think about what design patterns we could use for children, right, well, it's relatively simple. We need to think less about text, but more about visuals, especially in the early age. Storytelling is important, but that also is something that we can use to bring abstract concepts and kind of make them more concrete. We'll also look at large text and large tab targets. So again, at this point, we'll look at 18 to 19 pixels and maybe minimum 75 to 75. That's what you will find a lot of recommendations and guidelines for designing for children and books are recommending. You'll also find that we need to avoid bottom buttons, by the way, as children often tap on them by mistake. That's usually a cause for errors right there. And also, again, children, of course, expect feedback on every single section. They welcome sounds, voices, and background music. We might need a large navigation cars or carousels. And ideally, for positive reinforcement awards, we need intrinsic motivation rather than extrinsic motivation. And in fact, this is what we kind of want to build up. Because if you have extrinsic motivation, where we basically reward and give little gifts for something that's relatively simple to do, that's not necessarily motivating a child. We need to bring them to the notion of exploring more, maybe giving more challenges rather than actually just giving some awards right there, right? If you want to learn a bit more about this, there is a wonderful article on that, on how to increase players, well, children, intrinsic motivation, which goes into all the fine details of that right there. And also I can only warm-heartedly recommend a wonderful book on designing for kids by Deborah Levin-Gallman that goes into all the fine details of how to design for playing and learning, right? Katerina is wondering, it's a very good question as well right here, about what about older adults? Is it the same story or not? I'm glad that you asked, Katerina, because that's what I want to cover next. And we are going through this like, you know, racing. And of course, don't worry, we'll have time, like 30 minutes at least in the very end for any question that you have. But here, when it comes to older adults, the world is different. And it's so underestimated and so misunderstood. And this is just remarkable, because what you will find is that today on the planet, we have 1 billion people aged 60 plus. And you know, every time we think about an elderly or an older adult, the senior citizens that they call sometimes, we often think about, you know, people who are maybe have weaknesses or cannot use technology, or there are so many stereotypes that are so wrong, because we shouldn't be forgetting that people who happen to be 60 today, they also were like in the 30s, 40s, they lived with the internet. They grew up with technology in many ways as well, and they rely on technology for the last like what 20, 25 years. Shouldn't be forgetting that. And often, you know, with the rise of fitness and gym, they're often healthy, they're often active, they often have a very solid income and a very strong capital that they just want to spend. Also, often they're ignored as seen as one single entity. And very similar to what we see with children, we can never think about, okay, anybody above 60 is kind of the same persona. No. Again, at the same point when we're looking into people above 60, looking at 60 to 65. 65 to 70, 70 to 75, and it can also be broken down into 3 or 4, 2 years. Different people do it differently, right? There is a phenomenal research that's been done by Michal Halperin Ben Zvi on increasing usage of digital platform services and products by older people, which goes into a lot of detail about what it even means to design for older adults. But there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. First of all, as we grow older, our senses change, our vision changes, our hearing changes, our touching changes. That's not surprising, but it also affects smell and taste, for example. Our movement changes as well. It's more difficult to be more precise. The speed is changing, the steadiness is changing, the comfort is changing. The cognition is changing as well in terms of memory, speed of learning, information processing, and reaction time, but also attitude. And that's kind of the confidence that, you know, you're working on the right thing and you're doing things really well. What you also find is that very often, how would I put it best? You see the opposite happening of what we maybe are expecting. When it comes to older adults, very often they will be looking and exploring and reading for the entire page just to make sure they don't make any mistakes. And they will be spending quite a bit of time reading and scanning the page to find all the information that they need, even if it takes a lot of time, right? However, their movements are not precise, right? That's something that's important for us for drag and drop and stuff like that. And again, we shouldn't be assuming that all the adults struggle to use digital, right? There are significant differences in age groups. There is this known Stroop effect, which is actually quite common as we grow older, where we often read and analyze every word on a page, right? So we need to be very, very careful again about generalizing any kind of groups. I mentioned already that shades of blue and purple, but also yellow and green are becoming more difficult to distinguish, right? On the other hand, they also struggle with text input and precise movements. Well, I should say we rather than they, right? Perform actions that they need not meant to happen, take a bit more time, and also view error messages as a personal failure, right? So what do we do with that? Well, let's take a look at some patterns we can apply there. Most importantly, hover tunnels are a disaster. It's absolute disaster. I'm still wondering why we still have it in 2024. That should be gone and forbidden forever. Because when you have multiple nested menus and you open one menu and you try to open a sub-menu and you go for this hover tunnel and then you accidentally cross the wrong path, you have to start all over again. Anybody had this experience before? Pretty sure almost everybody did, right? This is not a great experience at all, right? And of course we said that, well, we're going to fix it. We're just going to, show it when people hover quickly, and then it's just going to be dismissed right away. Well, then you end up with something like this, which is extremely irritating for everyone, not just all the dots, for everyone. This is just bad. This is just bad on so many levels. Like, how come we actually even have that? And eventually we said, okay, we know how to fix it, right? We're going to have a delay like we do here. So you open the menu, but then you need to be really, really precise in order to be still in the right area, just to not stretch too far. And then before you know it, it's kind of the same problem all over again, just, not with that kind of hover tunnels. And we had somebody, I think it was Sharat, who wrote that Amazon has solved it. Yes, Amazon has solved it many, many years ago. This is a screenshot, I think, from something like 99 or 2001 or something. But the idea was, well, as long as you are hovering over an area, we track where the mouse pointer is. And then we're basically creating this triangle that connects the boundaries of the content block with the pointer. And then as long as you're moving within that triangle, we keep showing you this area, so you don't have any problem with delays. Yes, but in the world in which we are today, this is not enough, right? Because it also must be responsive. So what you see every now and again, you see this path being recreated for hover, especially when you're relying on buttons that open hover menus, right? Where you need to be very careful about where a person is, so you can draw with SVG and JavaScript this sort of path to make sure that people are staying in that area, because we don't know where exactly they're going to move. Why? Well, because you might have something else over here. You might have some, link or something else that you don't want to block, right? So that's one thing. And also, when it comes to something like context menus, we want the same, right? We definitely want to avoid something like this. This is very frustrating. I think that many of you have been in this situation as well, because this is the same problem, right? And ideally, we would want to avoid this and have something like this instead, right? Oh, that's much nicer. That's so much nicer. So how do we do that? Well, this is the same story like we saw with the Amazon pattern, where you basically try to create this triangle, right? And as long as you're staying within the triangle, you basically show this area. Now, sometimes you see this acting both on hover and on tap/click, not just on hover alone. This is new. I've never seen it before, actually. But sometimes you can click on an area or you can hover over an area. And so this is almost an expected behavior that you will find that actually helps everyone, not just older adults, literally everyone. Better accessibility is literally better for everyone, right? So here's that. If we actually go even further, we'll find that there are a lot of examples of things we can do even better than that. One example that where people are struggling a lot is the notion of error messages. And so for that project I mentioned in the beginning, what we spent was a ridiculous amount of time trying to study how do we get people to A, higher accuracy, B, higher completion rates. These were the metrics that I was tracked by, right? And we spent a lot of time really trying to figure out what would be the best option. So this is a simple form with personal details. We have a label, a hint, and then the text box, right? So one of them is optional, one of them is required. Now, when we started thinking about what would be the perfect text box, if you like, we had plenty of conversations around that. We need to think about labels, right? And I'm not going to read through all of that. You also find it on the slides. But there's a lot of conversations around that. We had to think about hints. We had to think about text box. We had to think about text box again. And we also had to think about text box one more time. And finally, we had to think about where exactly the error messages would appear. One question that came up is, how do we actually design required fields and optional fields? Right? So if I show you this now, do you understand which one of those are required and which ones are optional? Or which one? Please write in the chat, nope or yes. Okay, I see a no. Excellent. All right, well, does this help? Do we know for sure what is required, what's optional? Better, right? But why stop there, right? We can keep going. Well, wouldn't it be better to twist it? Because most of the time in our forms, the required fields are, the required fields, we have them, but optional, do we even need it? The vast majority will be required. So do we want to use asterisk in 2024, really? Should we flip it upside down and mark only optional? Is this better or good? Philip says, perfect. I see some people are not so sure. All right. We could say, well, hold on. Maybe if it's not clear enough, can we make it bold? Does this help? No, I see that. Make it red, says somebody said. All right. Well, maybe we could actually flip it. Okay, I can see. There's not much excitement here. What about this? Is it good to have both asterisks and bold optional? Too much. All right. Okay. Here. Okay. All right. So let's break down. Let's bring down our optional friend here. Better. No, still no. Christian, killing me here. What is going on here? Well, some people think still too much. Okay, but why stop at essays? Weren't we told throughout the last 20 years that it's always good to be explicit when it comes to labels, when it comes to buttons? Shouldn't it be like that? What about this? Better? Okay, oh my God, I'm really failing at this point. All right, everyone. Well, here's the deal, right? We always look at something at the level of component, but we shouldn't. Because in the application, it would look like this. And in here, there is no way to tell right away if it's optional, what is required. This doesn't help. You still need to scan the entire text to figure out what is optional, what is required. This helps, right? You can see right away what is required, right? But then you still think, do you need to highlight optional or not? This could be another conversation to have, right? And of course, if you do this is a disaster because it all looks like error messages all over the place, right? That's not working. Enrique brings up a nice question. Maybe we could actually make two sections, optional and required. Now, whatever you do, one thing I have to mention, please never do this. This is a big disaster that is just sad. It's just really, really sad. That's just, no, never, ever, ever. So here are a couple of ideas. On the one hand, you could say, all right, let's start with this. And if we have a few optionals that we're going to mark only them. Because you see that, for example, gov.uk suggests to do just that. We mark something in the interface to indicate that it's different, that it stands out. Most fields and forms today are required. So we need to mark only the exceptions, and that would be the optional fields. But then you look into e-commerce research and study, and you'll find that there is a different approach to that. By explicitly denoting both optional and required, the user isn't forced to infer anything. They can progress seamlessly throughout the entire form without any back and forth scanning of previous fields. So in my book, this is okay, but also this is okay, right? Ideally, though, I would say personally, if I can, I would kind of stick to this, right? But again, if you see that this is not working, then I'm probably going to start adding the asterisk right there. But there is another option. And another option that we tried, and I'm not sure if you're going to like it, but I'm going to show it nevertheless, is to do this. How do we feel about this, everyone? So basically, if we have optional fields, right, then why show them? They are optional. So that also makes the form much shorter, right? So instead of showing, optional fields all the time, you kind of have that. So maybe we could be kind of figuring that out, kind of doing that. Jens, I think, wrote that it might require JavaScript. Does it necessarily require JavaScript? I need to figure it out. Maybe not. But of course, you should not be expecting more people to actually fill in this form, which is kind of an issue right there. And of course, just to check, once you do open it, right, once you actually click on one of those fields, it actually shows up. The only thing that I want to mention here that probably because it's a button should look like a button, not like a link. That's a little bit confusing here, right? And you're absolutely right as well, Kimberly, because at this point, of course, if you have a hidden field, then the field will not be auto-filled, right? However, there might be an option to show all optional fields as well as an option. The point is, why hide them in the first place? Well, if we need to display them for one reason or the other, for legal reasons or whatnot, or that might be needed, well, then we want to have them. But at the same time, we still want to have an option to open them by default or open them all if you have, let's say, an employee that always relies or often relies on some fields, although they are optional, right? So, however, still, the reason why I'm showing this now is because this also creates another question. And the question is, where should the error message be? So once you have something like this, so you have an error message, where would you display it? Because you could display an error message here, right, with the tooltip or something. You could display the error message underneath the text box, right? You can display the error message maybe within the text box over here. You might have an error summary on the top that actually highlights that error message, and then you just basically highlight that field as erroneous if there is an error or whatever, right? I mean, of course, it's optional, so it can be pretty much anything probably, but if you actually fill it in and must comply with some format or whatever, we might want to indicate that there is an error, right? The question is, where would you display it? I see a lot of people here in the chat writing below, and I would strongly disagree. Because I strongly believe, and from the testing that we've been conducting, it's a great idea to display the error message above the text box, not below the text box. And here's a question, why? Why is that? Anyone? I mean, it's really difficult because we have like what, 900 people here in the room? Contextual? Ah, very good. Virtual keyboards, indeed. There are at least 3 good reasons why it's a good idea to do so. Because first, whenever somebody starts filling in, well, let me kind of roll back. An important thing that I want everyone to get, and this is why I'm talking about it in terms of like older adults, right? I want to make sure that there is a perfect clarity. My job is to make it very difficult to make mistakes for people, right? This is what I'm hired to do. I'm not hired to design a beautiful UI. I'm not great at this. My job is minimize errors, minimize mistakes, increase accuracy, increase completion rates and completion speed, ideally as well, right? That's what I'm judged by. And that means for me, I need to guarantee that people can recover from mistakes fast. The worst thing you can do, this is unbelievable. The worst thing you can do if you show an error message as a toast message or something that shows up in the right upper corner somewhere in another side of the universe, people need to find it and hunt for it because it appears somewhere over there. That's just not working. However, when somebody recovers from an error, they need to be able to see the label, they need to be able to see the hint, they need to be able to see their input, they need to be able to see the error message at the same time. I want them to be able to see 4 things at the same time: the label, the hint, the input, the error message, right? Now, if you show an error message underneath the text box, first of all, it will be covered by virtual keyboard when people are typing. That's number 1. Number 2, if you have a drop down, it will be obscuring the error message. Third, if you have autofill, browser autofill that people are relying, it will be obscuring the error message as well. If people tend to be using magnifying software to zoom in, they will not be able to read this error message unless it's actually quite, short, right? And on top of that, you might say, well, hold on, but there are 2 problems here, right? On the one hand, we have a problem with shifting layout because these errors will appear all the time. Well, yes, this is why we validate only on submit when you click on continue. Now, that's not necessarily going to work for every enterprise product, but we tested it once for saying, okay, we have this complex form that employees rely on in enterprise. What if we break it down into smaller pages and check how quickly people actually complete this form successfully? And that actually has improved, right? More pages not necessarily means worse. If people make fewer mistakes as a result of that, that's great. But there is one exception. The exception is if an employee relies on autofill and they have to reuse or repeat the same information over and over again, and they have this information in autofill, then of course it's much better to have everything in one screen, right? So on the one hand, right, we could say, all right, well, let's show it above. But if we need to show, let's say, more detail, right, what we can do is use a little mini accordion here, right? Maybe something like this, maybe even for error messages as well. When you are here with a label, and when you open this accordion, you can see at the same time the label, the hint, the text, and then if you do the same for error message, the error message as well, right? And that, in my book, the only way to guarantee that people will see everything, right, when they kind of try to recover from error messages. There was a question from Subban about why not update the label itself. It's important that people understand what they're typing, especially when they clear the text and it has maybe some filters or something. We cannot just remove the title. I want them to be able to see everything. By the way, in the example that I showed, there was we should not rely on color alone, right? So there should be an icon there as well. So Irene is saying you can just put the icon and error message instead of the no. This is the same story, right? So, and of course, if you have multiple errors at the same time, you can also summarize them within the accordion as well, right? I mean, of course, if it's a lengthy error, then you might want to start reworking on your errors, right? So there is that. I hope I didn't miss or confuse anybody here with this part, but I think it's actually quite impressive of what you can do with just this little thing. I'm not saying it's always going to work, but you can try and see if it actually is going to work for you. And the final thing before the break here, what you really have to keep in mind is drag and drop, right? And I promised to cover drag and drop, and so I better do that now. Because when we start looking into kind of accessible drag and drop experience, what we need to support on many different levels is something along the lines of this here, right? Whenever we have this card reshuffling, that's drag and drop. Whenever you're moving conversations, that's drag and drop. Whenever you're dropping or uploading something, that's often going to be drag and drop. Whenever you are kind of moving these cards like that, the same story. So what you see is that this is an example from Goldman Sachs design system, which is a fantastic design system, by the way, right? You basically have this handle. This handle is focusable, which means you can enter it with the keyboard, and then it kind of, I don't know, hovers over the others. And then you can use keyboards to move it up and down, right? And then you use space to let it rest again, right? That also goes for things like this here, when you have maybe a couple of items, like remember, maybe in a table, you have columns and the option to customize columns, show and hide columns, move columns around, stuff like that, have the same story. But that means that this control must be focusable. This also goes for things like resizing, right here, or selecting, right? You need to be able to resize and select with the keyboard. Or also here, when it comes to kind of maybe making a span, like a column or a cell a little bit larger than that, right? And the way it typically works is again with these keys: Tab, Shift, Space, and arrow keys. What that means then, explicitly, so if you happen to be here, and this is your initial state, you tab right here, then you click on space, well, you activate the space key, then the item gets lifted, then you use a keyboard to move it up and down, and then you use space again to let it be so it actually gets to its new space, right? This is again mandatory in terms of EAA. This is what we need to support. And I can hear the concerns from the other side of the internet about how would we make it on mobile then? That seems like a lot of hassle. Not really, you just do this. You have a little control, again, on each of those cards that you have, which allows people to actually move up and move down, or move left or move right in exactly the same way. In a similar way, like we often do it when it comes to files, right? We might have something like moving somewhere or anything similar. That would be the same story. And you will find it all over. This is the design system from Salesforce. I kind of use the same story. There is always going to be this handle where it allows you to move the element or whatever card you're using to navigate left and right. Okay, so that's right there. And just to finish that thought here, I think all of these little examples, little patterns, they're all aiming for giving people what they need when they need it without confusing them or creating any barriers for them to get to information that they actually rely on. In that case, when they need to perform an action, they need to be able to do that as well. And especially in the case of drag and drop, which is a bit difficult, could be a bit difficult for older adults, that really helps. And it's all about just one single principle that you often find in pretty much any discussion for designing for adults. When we're designing for adults, for older adults, we want to prevent errors by providing a very calm experience. This is where you might not want to have something like auto-applying filters, but actually apply on manual click, right? But also presets, inline filters, and anything. And we want to avoid precise movements. And as long as we're there, then we should be in a good place by giving people independence and competence that they can actually complete their tasks independently without relying on very precise requirements for the software that we're designing. All right. Whew. All right. That was the first half of our journey, everyone. Thank you for staying along all the time. I would love us to go in a little break. And then let's come back, because after the break, what's expecting us is something a little bit different, because we're going to dive into neurodivergence, specifically about how to design for ADHD, for dyslexia, for dyscalculia, and many other things as well. So stay tuned, and also autism and so on. And also we'll be looking about how to make and build a strong case for accessibility, right? With a couple of actionable tips and stuff in between. All right. So, dear friends, let's have a short break of, I would say, 7 minutes right here. And so you know when we're actually going to continue. And in the meantime, I'm going to drink some water. And sorry for about speaking so much. I think I need maybe I should not get my coffee. That would be too much. All right. See you in a bit, everyone, in 7 minutes. I'm going to go for your questions and just read them first in a moment. Hello, my wonderful people on the internet. And hello, I think I can see Sarina. Hello, Sarina. Good to see you right there. Sorry, everyone, I was a little bit nervous, I think, in the beginning, if I have to be perfectly honest. Usually, I'm very excited, but not in a dry way. Hope it was still okay. All right, everyone, thank you so much for coming back and staying all this time here with me and with all of us looking at all the fine details of inclusive design. So just as a quick note, because I'm contractually obligated to do that, we have launched this video course. If you are interested by any means, I do apologize for bringing this up every now and again. The password, the code is inclusive. That gives you a friendly coupon code. We also have some wonderful, wonderful conferences. If you happen, anybody from New York in the house? Crickets. Yeah, I have a couple of people. Well, maybe if you happen to be sure it counts. Of course, Jamie, it does count. Feel free to take a look. We have this wonderful, wonderful event coming up around, hold on, what was that? On front-end and UX, we also have something for accessibility. Oh, Karis was faster than me. Karis, you're always beating me. Karis is like fire speed or whatever. I don't know. All right, so feel free to take a look. All right, let's keep going. And of course, again, I just want to remind you, everyone, I will be trying to do my best to answer every single question that you have, be it in YouTube or here. Oh, this is the question. We'll be talking about this a lot in there. I just want to derail everyone at this point. All right. Grapes, break. Ready. I do like my grapes. All right. So everyone, let's dive in. And I think so far we're looking into some of the bits around inclusive design, design patterns specifically for children and adults, but we also looked into color blindness and motion sickness. And this is where we started, right? Kind of looking into the law, the regulations, but also color blindness, motion, children, all the adults. And we're kind of moving to the second part when we're diving into kind of neurodiversity, autism, dyscalculia, deafness, blindness, and also building up a strong case. And I hope that you will find quite a few useful examples right there. Right. So I think, it's been interesting for me to see that we have moved away, as we noted in the beginning, from this notion of accessibility towards inclusive UX. Fantastic to see you here as well, Elio. Right. But another thing that we really changed is the perception about how we talk about things that are diverse in general, which I'm really, really grateful for. I'm really, really happy for that. One of the terms that has emerged, and some people, especially on the business level, find it very, very confusing. It's the notion of neurodiversity. On its own, neurodiversity means kind of refers to a wide range of differences in how people think. And we can often think about it as similar to diversity in ethnicity, gender, sexuality, etc. And it's kind of used to describe traits associated with many different diagnoses, from ADHD and dyslexia. And it's kind of like an umbrella term, neurodiversity being an umbrella term that encompasses dyslexia, autism, ADHD, dyscalculia, and many other things as well, right? The thing is, when we're actually designing and we want to design inclusively, we need to keep in mind of the different specifics, and I think that attributes that everybody comes along with, right? And we're not speaking necessarily about disabilities at all. We're speaking about just people being different. And I think for me, there has not been a better place than this wonderful design system, content design system by Intuit, which goes into all the fine details about UX writing for all kind of groups, and also including conversation and AI and word list and accessibility and inclusion and so many things. It's absolutely incredible. So if you have a chance, please go ahead into Intuit content design system. It's actually really, really fantastic. I want to go through some of them, some of the things that might be relevant, especially within this umbrella of neurodiversity, to see if we are actually, what we can actually do with it. I need to apologize at this point because I might be, all of this is basically based on my research, right? And so if there are anything that, if there is anything that is wrong or incorrect or anything, please, please, please do let me know. That's very important for me to know. I don't want to spread the wrong things. And please correct me. Please feel free to unmute yourself, unmute your mic, and tell me that I'm wrong. That would be perfectly fine and reasonable. I don't want to make any mistakes. It's an area I just want to be very, very careful about. All right. So first of all, I think it's worth noting that there is a notion of dyscalculia Dyscalculia being, there is different data and different sources on that, but you will find that, oh, thank you so much, Yoram. I will have to double check. There are around 3 to 10% of people who seem to have dyscalculia. Most people have no idea that it exists and that they have it. It's a persistent, lifelong difficulty in understanding numbers. And remember, in the beginning, it's really just important for me to put myself in the shoes of people who actually experience dyscalculia on other things. So I studied what it's like on living with dyscalculia. Fortunately, there is a lot of videos from people who actually talk about their experiences. And this is what I learned. When you are living with dyscalculia, maybe you don't even know that you have it, but the experience will be like this. It will be hard to plan and estimate time or costs. That's pretty much all of us, I think, in one way or the other. It's hard to spot mistakes in bills and receipts because you're dealing with numbers and a lot of numbers. Cooking, for example, is tricky because of quantities that you have to respect. Medicine dosage requires a lot of attention. Distances to objects are very difficult to read. Look, this is kind of me. So if somebody asks me, what is the distance between here and there, I'm totally lost. I have no idea. It's really, really impossible for me to say if it's meter, feet, whatever. I really, really bad at this, right? On the other hand, also, it's very difficult to read and tell times and timetables, especially when you think about something like data tables, right, or charts, right? If you have a lot of data in a really complex data grid, that's difficult. Also difficult in arranging appointments, hard to hold numbers in memory, hard to remember pins, birthdays, scores, but also phone numbers and directions. And then this is what I do all the time. I do this all the time. To understand how big a number is, if it's like has a lot of zeros, I count the number of zeros to understand how big that number actually is. Anybody does that? Please write a plus in the chat. I do this all the time, like all the time. And so I think, again, it's one thing that's important for us to understand that it's when we're looking at the space, everybody is different. And in many ways, everybody is unique in a good way, right? And everybody has their weaknesses and has their strength. And we should never think about dyscalculia or anything like that as a weakness. If anything, it could be a strength as well, right? But it also comes up with some vulnerabilities, like, for example, poor spatial skills. That's also me, by the way. For me, it's always a thought. I need to think about north and south, west and east. I really have to mentally present it and kind of figure it out. And then also some people have experience with left and right. It's also another story. So what do we do with it to help people? Well, when it comes to dyscalculia, it's basically a difficulty to read and spot patterns in numbers. That's what it is, right? It can be hard to tell the numbers apart. So if you have 7 and L, sometimes they might look different. 0 and O, that's the story of my life. This is really incredibly painful. People also struggle with time blindness, kind of. Yeah, I mean, I've been there before. Somebody tells me, so how much time do you think you need? 20 minutes. And then 2 hours later, I'm still sitting there trying to figure out what it is, right? So what do we do with it? Well, that depends on how we present numbers. For example, this is coming from the wonderful NHS design system, which goes into all the fine details about how to present time. So for example, instead of using 5:00 p.m. or 17:00 hours, we just write 5 p.m. This is also a story of my life. When it comes to 12 a.m. or 12 p.m., I'm always really have to think carefully about what the hell is it now 12:00 midday or midnight? I mean, it's really a problem for me. So maybe writing like midnight or midday might be better, right? Also, instead of writing 6.5 hours, oh my God, this is also a story of my life. Maybe it might be better to write 6 hours, 30 minutes or something similar. That's just helpful or easier for everyone. So if we look at what we should be doing, what we should not be doing, I mean, frankly, my friends, it took me a long time to put this together. This is what I've learned. We don't use decimals unless you must. So if you have, let's say, a data grid, of course, you need to have 10.38 or whatever. But if you can round up, if it doesn't make a difference, it might be a good idea to do so. It is not the same as dyslexia. We'll talk about it in a moment. It specifically relates to numbers, but not necessarily to letters. That was a very good question, though, right? By the way, what was the problem with 6.5? Well, because to some people, that might feel like 6 hours, 50 minutes, but it's actually 6 hours, 30 minutes, right? So that's the difference. So when we actually put the things together, what we should be avoiding, what we should be using here. Well, first of all, if you ask people to repeat or remember a number, they might struggle with that, right? Any kind of countdowns or frequent lockouts, and that's actually going to be the same when we're speaking about ADHD later, brings people to abandonment very quickly, or they lose track and they leave altogether. It's ideally, if you have, let's say, I don't know, anything that requires numbers, maybe could not be the only option to type in numbers, right? And then you have problems right here, right? Which I'll get into in a moment. These are really problematic use cases. But on the other hand, when people are typing, remember when we type credit card number, we do it in chunks of 4. If it's a 16 number digit, we read the first 4, we type, we look at the screen to verify, we continue with the next 4. And it kind of keeps going, and it keeps going, and keeps going. But in between these chunks, we might want to leave space for people to orient themselves. And as they type, we might want to support spaces. When they use a space character to type, support that, or at least break it out in a way that actually has a space in between. If you have 16 characters right next to another, comparing them is very, very hard. Also, for example, if you have, let's say, something that like a reference number that you refer to, it's usually just a good idea to explain where to find it and what it even means. But then you also have these problems, right? If you have something like this here, we have 1 or 2 200 milligram tablets, it might be very difficult and challenging for people to understand because it might look like 2,200. It might look like when you have numbers next to each other, that's hard. That's not hard. 1 or 2 200 milligram tablets. That's kind of the UX writing world. Also, proper formatting. If you have, let's say, 1090, 93, 38, that depends, of course, on the country where you're coming from, because typography is going to change. If it's in Europe or if it's in the US, let's say, it's probably a good idea to have the comma to separate, especially when you're using, let's say, data tables again, where the data, these numbers must be right aligned, so it's easier for them to be compared. And we also want to use a monospace font there, right? This is really awkward somehow, 0.5 mg, right? So 0.5 is actually better, again. This is, again, the research coming from the NHS and gov.uk and many other government services that actually try to optimize specifically for presenting data, but it's not like from Goldman Sachs or something similar, right? Also, mixing numbers is problematic. Something like this is very confusing to everyone because you have minus and plus at the same time. It might be better off to write at least 3 to 4 teaspoons. This was a real revelation to me. According to research, superscript is problematic. First of all, because it's very small. Second of all, it's also just very difficult for people to scan quickly. So if you have a superscript, please be careful, right? It's maybe that's not a great idea. And also, by the way, as I think Yoram is writing, dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, they're all very, very deeply connected. It's kind of all a part of what we're kind of covering here. Anyway, and some of those things apply to all of them, but some do not. It's just something to keep in mind. But please, again, Yoram, please feel free to correct me. I don't want to make any mistakes here. So at least 3 to 4 teaspoons. First and second might be okay. Most design systems around there, again, gov.uk, NHS, and also Government of Canada and also Australia, they all recommend to use the same letter size, not superscript for those things. Again, related to numbers. And I mean, you would say, come on, give me a break. Do we really need to go into all these details? Not for every project, maybe, but when you're dealing with a fintech application, with online banking, when people are dealing with money, when it comes to spreadsheets where they're dealing with money, you probably want to spend that amount of detail and attention to avoid any kind of mistakes or wrongdoings accidentally, right? Also, spaces for units here. There's something to decide. Typically, because it's kind of connected, we want it to be perceived as such. Shortened months are problematic for screen readers because sometimes they would call this Jan if it's German, right? Instead of Jan or January, right? So that's kind of an issue here. So January, February is typically better. And also if you have some fractions which are tricky to understand, like 14.3%, if it's 1 in 7 people, it's probably always better to say like that. It's just easier to read and understand, right? Nothing fancy here, but I think it just kind of gives us a foundation to work within. Also, again, as I showed, if you have spaces, just keep spaces, right? If you happen to be on, pagination maybe, it's not a bad idea to duplicate that content and say, well, you're on a 3rd page of 9 or so. If you actually have this sort of a chart that indicates progress, you probably want to include 50% completed here as well, right? And if it comes to something like a meeting that you can visualize, Well, you can actually combine the iconography and text to explain that this is 15 minutes long and this is a quarter of an hour. Because in many ways, when you actually also talk to people who actually struggle with time blindness, they think about chunks of time. And that chunk is typically either 10 minutes or 15 minutes. Because it's quarter of an hour, it's just easier to deal with it. Right? So that's that. That seems to be reasonable. You will find a lot, and I mean a lot of detail about dyscalculia on a wonderful, wonderful website put together by Laura, forgot the name, Laura, on accessible numbers. So accessiblenumbers.com. You also find it in the Google Doc where I'm highlighting it as well. So not really groundbreaking, but find details that actually can help everyone, like literally everyone. And especially for people who are dealing with money, that can be a deal breaker. Right? Okay, I'm just going to double check the chat. It'll be good for everyone, Paul, I think, actually. Right? Yeah, we'll talk about that as well, Vitaly. So that's good call as well. Laura, not Kalbeck. I have to double check, I'm afraid. Laura Parker, excellent. Thank you so much, Amanda. All right. Okay, so this is dyscalculia. We also have dyslexia. Dyslexia is affecting around 6 to 10% of the population. The reason why these ranges are so broad is because there is no like official data around the world. You need to find like one source and another source here. This is what I found. Sometimes it's claimed 6%, 7%, 9%, 10%. So this is a range. I don't want to lie to you here, right? Around 6 to 10% of the population, and that's a lot of people, have some sort of dyslexia. It's a condition that involves difficulties with writing and typing. It's also about reduced reading experience, word recognition, spelling, and decoding. And very often people compare people who have dyslexia and people who don't have dyslexia with something like this, right? And it can also apply to ADHD as well. Because sometimes what happens is, I mean, it actually should be in a different section anyway. Like for neurotypical people, as they would be called, right? You basically have something in mind and you do that. But very often you might be distracted along the way and you might be easily distracted by many other things. So that path to that goal is actually much, much, much broader. It has a lot of different things that happen along the way before you actually get there. So that would be if I'm not mistaken again, kind of the representation of what something along the lines of neurodivergence would look like, right? But again, that might be inaccurate because again, at this point, this specific image should be related to ADHD, where it's very easy to be distracted, right? Okay, but when we're talking about dyslexia, right? People with dyslexia, and we usually don't talk about dyslexic people, by the way, just to keep it in mind. It's always kind of like a people-first approach when it comes to speaking about conditions or mental disabilities or temporary disabilities and so on. Not dyslexic people, but people with dyslexia are more likely to find most important details hidden in a sea of data. This is their superpower. They're very, very good at this. There aren't really different types of dyslexia, right? Although I wrote in the past like some sort of dyslexia. It's one thing, but everyone is in the continuum. So it expresses itself differently, but it's just one thing. So when we think about this specifically, very often you will find articles that tell you, go ahead and use a dyslexic font, right? Maybe something like Open Dyslexic 2, which according to test is actually a really poor choice for people with dyslexia. So if your test shows that this helps, go for it. But typically something like Atkinson Hyperlegible that actually works for not just for dyslexia, but for everything, it's probably going to be much better. But in fact, you also see, and Nina is right, it also shows that some research shows that Comic Sans performs better than Open Dyslexic. Yes, but Comic Sans also probably performs worse than Atkinson Hyperlegible. So if anything, I would go with the one on the left. Often it will be this notion of holes in between that make the text a little bit easier, a little bit more difficult to read. That's again the question about what you can find, because again, from the research that I found, right, despite all the differences and some fonts being designed specifically for dyslexia, the Atkinson Hyperlegible performs best. So we can keep that in mind. Okay, so what is dyslexia then like? Well, again, let's see what people say, what it's like for them. First of all, dyslexia means that it might be difficult to follow sequential instructions. Indeed, people do struggle with spelling and writing. They have trouble with scheduling and time management, like we saw with dyscalculia as well. They have challenges in expressing their ideas verbally, heavily distracted by flashing images and sounds. Again, I'm not saying this is all people with dyslexia are like that, but this is what you will find when you read articles about how people describe their experienced life daily with dyslexia. There might be, of course, a combination of dyslexia and dyscalculia at the same time. It's not, nothing is one-on-one cut, right? And then we also have things like this here: challenges in organizing thoughts and materials, difficulty in filling out forms, trouble following rules in games and at a workspace, hard to understand abstract concepts, subtle social cues, signs and labels, and also, as we saw previously, poor spatial skills when it comes to north, south, left, right. Kind of the same story. So what do we do with that? Well, specifically what I could say is these are, sorry, I didn't prepare another slide for that, I should have. Typically, this is what you can find recommended, right? I have never designed anything for people with dyslexia, so I don't know for sure, but this is what you can find. You'll find that there is a recommendation to avoid heavy underlines, uppercase, and italics. There is a lot of struggle with italics. In fact, this is why you will find quite a few websites that are designed for organizations or institutions for dyslexia. They don't use italics at all, right? So that can be problematic there. But on the other hand, also because you can't rely on accurate spelling, you can use autocomplete at its best. When it comes to text, we want to avoid always align to the left. We don't want to have lengthy columns for reading. And again, what's also recommended, simple sans serif fonts with generous spacing that seem to be performing best, and using dark gray instead of black and soft colors instead of white. If I'm being honest, for me, dyslexia is the most, from the UX perspective and accessibility perspective, the most obscure topic for me. I still find myself struggling and floating. I'm not quite sure, right? Because I found it very difficult to find any research on that. So I don't want to tell you anything wrong, but this is again what you will find most of the time if you do conduct some research on that, right? If anything, I would go with X and HAP eligible, right? And I would try to make sure that I'm avoiding flashing images, maybe italics as well, and just making text scannable, right? That is kind of important. The things on the top, though, that's quite important. This is really rare. Now, that's what I discovered. That, you know, sometimes you see people confusing and swapping B, P, D, and N, and U, and M, and W because they look similar. That happens, but it's actually quite rare, right? Remembering words or passwords is difficult indeed. Flashing images sounds, yes, that's a problem. Difficulty to read analog clocks, time, direction, numbers, also true. But, you know, there was a study, I think it's 7 years ago, about reading taking up at around 3 times longer for users with dyslexia. It was one study. I couldn't find anything else on that. So I'm not quite sure. This is like a big question marks for me, just for you to keep in mind as well if you have a conversation about that at work. Okay. I'm just going to drop in the chat to see what's going on here. Yeah, and of course, again, all those things are the same. So if we help people kind of make sense of words and numbers better, then it's just better for everyone. And again, if you kind of keep going, there are kind of 2 more things to keep in mind. One of them is autism. Autism is affecting around 1% of population. It's often seen, I don't even know why, but sometimes it's seen as sort of a temporary sickness. It isn't. It's just a different way of experiencing the world. And children with autism grow up into adults with autism as well. But very similar to as we saw previously, no 2 people with autism are the same. This is what it's like to live with autism, okay, according to people who actually live with autism. They experience life as constant chaos, like a roller coaster all the time. Everything is intense, everything is tangled, and if you have anything that's uncertain or they feel a lack of control, then have very low tolerance for that. Very sensitive to bright colors, high contrast, but also in terms of like physical experience, like cold temperature, hot temperature, skin rash, anything like that. Also loud music and loud sounds, right? Apparently, also there is a strong desire to trust people, which sometimes is called the naivety effect of people who live with autism. They just tend to believe the best in people around them. Often prefer quiet nature sounds instead of conversations, might feel overwhelmed in a crowded setting. And this is kind of the magic part. I mean, all of these kind of conditions, if you like, have their superpowers. Like, for example, the best thing you can do is to find somebody who has autism and deeply cares about whatever problem you're solving, because they have an extraordinary level of concentration that they can bring into place, unlike anybody else. This is just extraordinary. If they do something that they love, according to what I was reading, that's just extraordinary results can come out of that, which is why they would also be called creative geniuses in those things that they love. Can be very literal in directing conversations, but also unique in problem solving and ideation. Now, this is a lot of stuff in here. Let me show you a couple of examples, kind of make better sense of it. I think one thing that is problematic for all of us is when we experience something like this. So if you have radio buttons and you have segmented control or buttons like this, right? This is a challenge for everyone. That's a challenge for people with dyslexia. That is a challenge for everyone, also for all the adults, for everyone. Why is that though? That's weird. What is the problem? Isn't it clear what's selected and what isn't? Like, I mean, you have the, hello, Oliver. Like, we have the blue background and white text on it. We have white text or white background with blue text on it, right? Well, that's a huge problem, like a huge problem. Of course, if you have like 5 options, that's easier, right? But this is really difficult. So what people tend to do when they encounter this, they start the dancing, right? They dance between the two because they're not sure which one is selected now and which isn't, right? So the best thing you can do is to avoid kind of these opposite colors. And sure enough, if you just use radio buttons, that might be even better. But in general, if you just use a shade of blue, maybe like this here, that's better. The only thing, if you keep going in this direction, you want to probably be very clear that this is a selected state, but this is not a focus state. Because this here looks a little bit more like a focus state or selected with the keyboard. And this one maybe looks like a selected state. So again, a shade of blue is going to look much better than the actual, like the opposite color. This is always an issue right there. So we probably want to avoid that. If anything, I would go in this direction, but of course we still need to have a focus state or active state. And so that would probably be something like that here, right? A lot of people really struggle with it because it's really difficult to distinguish between the two, right? We also see that, for example, situations like, let me see, this are problematic, right? Whenever you see a pop-up showing up, I always question my life choices. And I really mean it. Because when I think about this, why are we doing this actually? Well, to get the leads, right? But we don't want random leads. We want good leads. We want leads that convert. So when you look at, let's say, a newsletter showing up like this, especially when it comes to Generation Z, and I mean, I really have to ask you at this point as well, who will be using a fake email address like tempemail.org or something similar when you encounter this pop-up just to get a coupon code? Please write a plus in the chat, also in YouTube, because I can see you in YouTube as well. Anyone? A lot of people. So for Generation Z, it's between 70 to 85%, right? So why the hell are we doing this, friends? Why are we doing this? This is just weird. Because when we show this, and a lot of people will give a fake email address, as a business, I don't want that. As a business, I don't want fake email addresses. I want to get people who are interested in the product that I'm selling, right? So how do we actually fix it? And so one thing that we decided to try out, right, is this instead. I'm going to let you sit with it for a moment. I'll let you know, is it better? Is it the same? Does it solve the problem or not? Well, you can say, well, hold on. You can still type in your, fake email address, right? Yes, but here's a question. Right? It's still an expensive watch, Lisa. I totally agree with that, right? But here's the deal. Well, if you show it on pages where people don't care that much about the correctness or accuracy of the email address, right? Like, for example, between search results or something like that, they're just not as effective. So if, however, here you say, well, we'll send the confirmation message to that email, there is a little trick over here. The trick is, sure, people can go ahead and use a fake email address, like 5 minutes email address and so on. Hold on a moment, because here you're subscribing. Maybe you'll be looking around the page for a while. I mean, unless you go straight away to checkout, sure, right? But if you have a 5 minutes email address, right, Well, you do want to get the confirmation message and you do want to be able to act on it. But if you actually add a note here saying that it will be used in your checkout, oh, that changes everything, right? It changes everything. Because if you basically say it, apply or add or something, it will be used in your checkout, right? And you'll be still having an option to actually change it later. Well, it comes to the correctness of the email address. People care about it most either before they bought something, or immediately before they bought something, or once they've bought something. Which means just before they bought something, we can give them a little pop-up, not pop-up, but a little like message saying that, hey, can you double check your email address if this is correct or not, right? And once they've purchased something, right, we want to have an option for them to be able to say, oh, hold on, that's another email. Can I change the email there? Because when people land on the confirmation page, that's the magical page. That's the page that you can do so much with and nobody really does. This is where you can say, oh, subscribe to this newsletter. This is where you can, because people stay there, right? Because they take the screenshot of this page to not lose it. They save it as a PDF. They check email to make sure that this confirmation arrives and everything. So maybe we can just tap into it, right? Now, the Hannah is wondering what's the link to autism over here? Well, basically, every time you get something like this is a problem for everyone, not only for people with autism. This is just a problem for everyone. That's a very good question, Hannah. That's maybe kind of a tangent there, so I do apologize for that. But when it comes to these pop-ups or anything that happens unexpectedly or annoys people a lot there, that's just not necessarily helpful. It's kind of just distracting at this point. And this drives people on a different path altogether, right? But very good point. Thank you so much for bringing this up. All right. Okay, so there is that about that. And on the other hand, also anything that actually relates to, those pop-ups could be really kind of a story on its own at this point, of course, as well. All right, moving on from there then, one missing bit that we haven't covered yet is ADHD. ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and that's exactly that. That's the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? It affects around 5% of children, 2.5% of adults, right? It shows in forgetfulness, in time blindness, its impulsivity, and also in hyperactivity. So that's what living with ADHD is like. People tend to forget details very quickly. They often seek novelty, not routine. This is unlike autism. With autism, you kind of want to have your routine, you want to have structure as much as you can. But with ADHD, you're looking for something new all the time. Very poor focus and very poor attention, especially for boring tasks. Would chase attention and excitement nonstop, have also trouble sitting still, and also have racing thoughts. Very easy to come up with ideas, but not as good as executing them necessarily. And in general, routine tasks that they have to do every day are quite difficult and quite annoying to execute. Very difficult to handle unstructured situations. We'll talk about it in a moment, right? And very hard to listen to others while holding a thought. That's, I think, affects all of us, right? And often don't remember where things are. Just forgetfulness, I would say. This shows up in many different places. This also applies to pretty much anything when you have an overwhelming number of options. Like this. You want to book a bowling night? Good luck with that. So what do we have here? 5:15, 5:30, 5:45, 6:00, and so on and so forth. And there are also other dates. Just a lot of buttons. You might say, not a big deal. You just select the date. Yes, but how do you make a decision? So, because if you come in, let's say at 6 and you're late by 10 minutes, then you are charged, but you are just, maybe late by 20, 25. So you kind of need to think about, okay, when exactly am I going to be there? That's a problem. And so what sometimes happens when people encounter this, they just pick a random time. Like a random around 6, right? Whatever. And then they try to do the best. Very often coming way too early, right? Or way too late. That also can, of course, happen. Right? And then, of course, once you get to this point where you have to fill all the details and you have all the buttons, again, this is not exciting. And you should be expecting a lot of people who happen to be having ADHD living at this point. There's a lot of stuff in here, which is just too much. So what do we do with that? Well, if we want to avoid certain things, we probably want to avoid showing a big number of options all at once. Again, I'm talking about like a general guidelines for ADHD, but of course, if you have, let's say, an employee working in a bank, working on processing mortgage applications, you probably can't do that, right? You probably need to figure out some sort of a balance that would be making your employees effective or efficient. But that's something to keep in mind, because you can still try to break a big flow into smaller chunks and see if it's actually performing better for everyone. Again, we do not want to ask people to repeat or remember numbers. Countdowns are a problem. Frequent lockouts are a problem because people get distracted all the time. They might be filling up a form, they get distracted, they move on, and then when they come back, you have frequent lockout and you cannot access your account anymore, right? This also happens, by the way, and this is important. This also happens with password recovery. The average abandonment rate for password recovery, when people are going through the password recovery loop in e-commerce, is around 18.75%, which means 18.75% of people who actually added to the cart want to proceed to checkout and have to go through the password recovery loop, abandon. And that number will be much higher with people with ADHD because there will be less tolerance, much less tolerance to completing here, right? And of course, auto-playing videos are distracting. Poor performance, the website is slow, abandonment. Long unstructured text paragraphs are skimmed and skipped. Poor scannability of content is also problematic, right? And again, password recovery is actually a story. This is why people are so good at bending the rules, right? So if you forget your password, you have to recover it and you have to set it up. What people tend to do a lot, and please write a plus if you do the same as well, they take the old password and don't talk to me about password managers. Only 32% of people use it. Most people take the password that they keep reusing over and over again, despite the fact that it's insecure, right? And they will be writing it down, and then they add just one missing character to pass the gates to meet the password requirements. Please write a plus in the chat if you do that, right? That's not really secure. I mean, please move to password managers if you can, right? But a lot of people do not, right? So what do we do with it? Well, if it comes to a complex flow, we could ask people to prepare all documents ahead of time and give people a list, a bullet list about what they need to have. If they're filling an insurance form, or you need to have ID, you need to have this form, you need to have this certificate, you need to have these details and stuff like that, right? Ask also what the goal is up front. Like very often what happens is we have a lot of navigation, we have a lot of filters, we have a lot of stuff, and we don't really have a proper onboarding to get people where they want to go faster, right? So it might be a good idea to help people say, hey, this is stuff for you. So you're risk averse, go here. You want to go on a longer trip, go here. You want to, I don't know, book a ticket, go here. Just giving people very clear pointers where to go. One thing at a time works better. We'll see an example of that in the form in a moment. When you take a complex long form and you break it down in many, many, many small pages. In fact, I would say, especially for ADHD, more smaller pages are way better than one big page or like two big pages, right? You might also want to remind people of some key events, unfinished drafts and stuff like that, show recent files, use filters, presets, and again, because people kind of tend to abandon and jump out and in, you want to reduce logouts so people can't proceed, they don't have access anymore, and also logouts. Your session has expired, stuff like that, right? And chunk everything, processes, forms, and allow people to continue, save and continue later. And also a few other things. Again, more simple pages, not one long page, and disclose details gradually. Example of that. The worst thing you can do today on the web, and that applies to ADHD partially, but also to everybody else, is to support and actively encourage people to follow the F pattern when scanning a page. F pattern is indeed an escape route for most people because this is where how they try to process a page, right? Where they try to basically, if you're not familiar with the F pattern, you basically start reading on the top when you get on a new page. And as you keep going down the page, you read less and less and less and less. This is extremely ineffective way of scanning, but this is the best that people are using, have adopted over the years, right? The problem with that is that people skip a lot of important details when they follow the F pattern. That will be extreme for people with ADHD as well, right? Some people go with that pattern when you have something like a structured grid or something like e-commerce page or a listing page or something like that. But what happens to be way more effective is a layer cake pattern. This is where you maybe have specific headlines or maybe little, pills, green pills, let's say, or blue pills that guide people's attention. So they will be looking here and here and here because these are the only things that actually stand out on the page. Layer cake means you kind of guide people to see whatever they need to see. The most important things on the top, and as they keep going down, kind of point and guide their attention, with just a bit of maybe blue pills or green pills or something like that, right there. If you don't have any color, that will be difficult unless you're using bold. And there are also other patterns. Commitment pattern, by the way, it's very common for older adults. right here, because they will be reading everything like literally in detail. Some people kind of scan, some people look for one specific thing, and based on an image maybe kind of dive into that, right? I'm going to show you an example of that in action, just to make it very, very clear. This is going to be around 1 minute video of a person using Google first and then comparing things in a table, right? So please see if you find any interesting patterns there. It's like 1 minute long. Oh, by the way, I need to explain as well. These red bubbles represent where the user is looking, where their attention is, the kind of the eye gazes, and the intensity of the eye gaze is the size of the bubble. Let's take a look. Just 20 more seconds. All right, and just keeps going like this for a while, right? Did you spot anything? Could you write in the chat? Any surprising things? Surprising patterns? There was a question about how these blobs are generated. This is done using the eye tracking software, which basically measures the intensity of an eye gaze, done by Norman Nielsen Group. Oliver trying to avoid images, good call. The page jumping made the person's eye jump too. What a mess, says Anya. That and focus, all right, keeps rechecking the headers, skipping the ads, not paying attention to them at all, looking at the small text. A lot of back and forth between the different parts on the cells. All right, check back on the headings a lot, repeated back and forth, excellent. Indeed, that's actually quite interesting indeed, because when you start looking here, there are a few things that are really important to take away from this. First, when you actually are here, right? And this is a video from 2020 or 19 or so that's a little bit old, right? But what you see here is the following. First, when a person enters the page, and this is just one person, so it cannot be very representative here, but still very useful to know. There is this notion of actually looking up the suggestions when they happen here, right? And then they start typing, and there are no eye gazes here. What is that person doing here? Why are there no eye gazes at all? Indeed, this person is looking at the keyboard. A lot of people, we just don't know how many, a lot of people never look at the screen while typing. So you cannot have them relying on autocomplete because they will not see it. Because every time they type, right, they will be looking at the keyboard. What's important though, there are always two phases. On the one hand, you have this phase, when they start, they look. When they end, they look. But in between, they don't look, right? That's actually important for us to understand. All right, then they move on and they click, and then they abandon this area discussed on the top because, of course, it looks like sponsored content or whatever, or top stories. That person seems to be looking for a comparison between PS5 and Xbox Scarlet. All right, and then there is a lot of looking right here, quite a lot of looking before there is a decision to proceed or not to proceed, right? And these are jumps, right? This is scanning. These are jumps. It's not reading, right? And then there is this lookup over here. I mean, I think the reason why the person didn't take it is because it's like, it sounds a little bit newsy, maybe not quite what they're looking for. Then there is this jump, and then immediately next. Why is that? What happened here that brought person right away from the second result? Yes, so it could be that this is a domain lookup, right? They just want to avoid it. It doesn't seem like maybe trustworthy. Sorry if you're working for Daily Star, everyone, right? And then we keep going to IGN, and there is quite a lot of attention again spent over here. I mean, quite a lot of looking everywhere before you commit to that link, right? And then you click. And once you click, the first thing that we do is we look at the heading to verify that we're on the right page. right? And then you see this F pattern appearing, like there is this cookie consent being closed. That's not that common in Germany, by the way, right? And then we see the reading. This is reading, but this is the only reading on the entire page. Because once they get there, right, we should not be assuming that people just follow linear path. This is definitely not going to be the case for ADHD either, right? It might be the case for older adults, but not for ADHD. Here, we jump right in the table, right in, somewhere in the heart of it, and then we just try to orient ourselves over here, right? And then eventually we kind of look at the headings, and then we compare again what we are looking at, if we're looking at the right thing, and then there is a stabilization phase that has happened. And after that phase, right, again, a lot of movement all over the place, right? Again, looking up these headings yet again, and then we start, right? And the start is then a little bit more sequential. We kind of go row by row, looking at the titles, looking at the headings, and then going through the details. Keep in mind that that person doesn't have to look at TBA on every single column to see that there is, similarity between them, because we are very good at peripheral scanning as well. Like peripherally, we also see, we don't need to actually pay attention to that. And so these TBAs are really easy to dismiss. There are these jumps to the headings, as you have noticed, right here, there. But then the interesting part happens when we actually get to the core of the comparison, to the actual details. Right? Some of you mentioned there are these jumps, right? We often forget, very quickly forget what we were looking at because we cannot keep it in memory. That goes for everyone. That also goes for ADHD, of course, as well. And then when we compare in chunks. So we'll look at some parts here, when then we look at some parts on the other hand. And then we come back. It's kind of this dance back and forth. And we look at the other chunk, and we compare that chunk again before we move on, right? And then we have this comparison yet again in chunks. A little bit here, a little bit there. Back, a little bit here, a little bit there. Back, a little bit here, a little bit there. And we keep repeating this over and over until eventually we again forget about this title that we had on a column header, right? And then we jump eventually, I think, back up to double check the heading. Maybe not, right? This is kind of the similar pattern. That's quite incredible, right? To see this just kind of in action. And so when we see and when we look at something like this kind of behavior, this brings me to a very simple conclusion. And you might disagree with it, but what I'm going to show you, I'm very, very proud to have discovered, and I think that this is something that needs to be everywhere. This is the city of Düsseldorf in Germany. And in there, they have navigation, they have search, but additionally, and I wish it was almost everywhere, by the way, they have this section saying, hey, what do you want to do here? Well, I want to book an appointment, right? Okay, I want to book an appointment. Where? For consultation. Boom, you get right where you want right away. That's fast, no distraction. You don't have to go through pages of navigation or search. We just go, right? This is another example from AO, which is an e-commerce retailer, right? We basically say, what do you want to do here? I want to buy a washing machine. Okay, what kind? Front loader. Okay, how big? Big, right? They need to find the price range. Boom, 11 seconds to get from nothing on the homepage to a relevant selection with free filters applied in a category that's relevant for you. That's fantastic. That's just great for everyone. Why don't we use it more of that? There is no navigation, there is no search, right? There is like that. And in fact, I would argue that we maybe overestimate search. Why do we have search results pages? They're just very strange. I mean, sometimes I feel like I know, websites better than I know my friends and neighbors. So if I go to the city of Amsterdam, right? I love it. So if you type in something like education here, there is no search results page, because what you get here is not a list of search results or anything. You can initiate it and you can actually get to see search results pages. But why would you do that? Why don't we drive people straight away, not to keywords, but to sections? So you're looking for bilingual education? Boom, you just click right away and go straight away to bilingual education. Isn't that much better? Why do we even show search results sometimes? That might not be needed, like at all, right? The same also goes for things like this here. Maybe, what was that? I think MediaMarkt, right here. Some of you might have seen this, so I apologize if you already have seen it. So if you type in HDMI here, you get this overview. This is a big e-commerce retailer in Europe, right? So we have this, and we have basically this view. So could you write a plus in the chat if you know for sure how a click on this arrow here is different, or what you think at least, different from this. And also, please write same if you think that this is the same. Okay, I see a lot of sameness. Let me just double check in YouTube as well. I see a lot of same. It isn't. Oh, it isn't. Now, when we look at it, this is how it works. And when we click on this word here, sure enough, it's going to execute this search. Great, so it's the search results, not surprising. But if I now click on the arrow, this is what happens. One is autofills, Kira is writing, and the other is search. Okay, could you write in the chat plus if that's what you expected? So if somebody has been using like Google Maps or so, and maybe also this kind of media market in the past, you will probably get learned how to use it, how that works. That's fine. But the problem is that very often this is a very disorienting pattern that people just don't understand. I mean, this is a very useful pattern that really nobody understands. So let me give you a bit of an example of what you can do with it to make it a bit better. Let me just find it very quickly. Here we go. Sorry about that. Here we go. That's the one. So Google used this very pattern for a very long time, for a while now. And they're moving away from it towards something that looks a little bit more like this. We have these buttons and you have the searches. And so when you click on the button, like Fortnite or whatever, you basically just get that effect where this word gets added to the text box and then you can continue from there. So if anything, if you're working on something similar, right, that might be a good idea to explore because this might be performing a bit better because the other one just doesn't work. That one I haven't tested, but the other one just doesn't seem to be working really well, all right? Okay, so this again, just to avoid confusion, avoid kind of situations with the mental model and so on. But remember, there was one more thing where we talk about breaking into chunks. And dear friends, I know that I'm not that late yet, so thank you much for staying along. If anything, you will also get a video recording and everything, right? There is also another pattern right there. Charlotte, I got to you in a moment, right? That when we look at breaking down into chunks, there is nothing more impactful than a task list pattern. Again, this is something that WCAG has established. And the idea is to reduce complexity by framing long forms into a series of tasks that are necessary to complete that form. Each of these tasks lives on a separate page. Sorry about the typo here. It makes the process much more manageable, says Adam. The idea being creating something like this for every complex flow. We have statuses like completed, in progress, not started, cannot start yet, and something similar, where basically you break it down into sort of a dashboard view for your form, for your complex process, right? And then you give it a name that people can complete and return to. You just need to allow people to save and exit, right? And the way it would work in practice, like you would be pretty much going through some forms and you can click and continue, then you move on, and you have the option to save and exit, right? But here's the trick. The trick is, while you do that, you do not, and I repeat, you do not use progress indicators. Why not? What's the deal with progress indicators? Why do we hate them so much? Well, at least I do. Why is that? Aren't they the standard and great and fantastic and wonderful and everywhere? Here we go. Carolina is right, because it's basically only linear. Because many of you might have been in a situation where you're filling in a complex form, you happen to be on step 3. You click on continue, and because of some dependencies, because of some conditionals, you click on continue and you're still on step 3. Anybody been in this position before? But you don't know why, necessarily. You just happen to be still on position number 3, right? This creates an enormous abandonment most of the time, unless people have to fill in the form, right? So this creates a massive abandonment because you don't know how much time you're going to spend on it, right? So what do we do instead? Great question. And again, by the way, just to be very specific about this, what are the issues with progress indicators? Well, if you have this task list, you have it on the dashboard, right? But people are confused about how they work. ADHD will always be abandoning very, very quickly when this happens. Some users are intimidated when seeing them. Some people don't see them. Some people, it of course doesn't work on smaller screens. If you have longer labels and conditional sections, it's hard to make it work, right? And it might be a good idea to explain what users need and how long it will take to complete in the first place, right? So what do we do then? Well, this is an idea here. Well, you might have a small step, I don't know, step 2 out of 5, a step 2 out of 7, and you have this progress. I mean, it's not a kind of progress indicator really, but you basically have a collapsible. We can show all steps. It's vertical, right? And show this step, and you can jump between those steps as well. Maybe potentially you could have 2 columns at the same time. It might be needed in enterprise as well. But then you can see where you are and potentially also including the statuses for each of these sections as well. If you wanted to, in this case, it was not needed, right? So this is a different way to present it than let's say, progress indicator is, and it doesn't lie. Because here, if something happens and you realize that you need more, you can also add it and indicate it that this is needed now as well, right? Mobile experience of this, Duigu, very good question. Well, this would collapse into an overview, right? By default being collapsed, you can expand it and then you basically would get the same story. You would get the same overview right there. It's almost like a Shopify checkout where you basically can jump in between. Okay, pretty much the same story. That also relates to something else, which I actually just want to mention very briefly here, although it's not necessarily directly related, but you will see this being important in a moment. There is nothing that's more confusing, more weird, and more disorienting to people than something as simple as an X icon. Can anybody in this room tell me the difference between the click on the X and click on the done? What's the difference? Is there a difference? None. And then there is a shrug again at this point. Well, that often creates a lot of confusion, right? Now, that depends on what you're expecting, right? And what people are expecting, what your users are expecting. Because of course, when you click on close here, it might be clearing the card, which it does, ironically. When you click on done, you just proceed from there, right? So there is that. You'll find these kind of really confusing bits all over the place. If you have maybe something similar to, I don't know, reset button, cancel button, and anything like that, it really is confusing. I will be old school here. Just write what it does. So if it's going to dismiss, just have a button here saying dismiss and close or something like that. Just proper labels. You don't rely on X. X can be anything. It's so confusing in so many scenarios. When you think about what all the things that it actually could mean, I think I actually had this note over here, right? You'll find that X can mean cancel, close, ignore, but also save, back, delete, reset. There are many things over here. So sometimes we need cancel, but then of course, just make it very obvious, like apply and continue or close and dismiss. I think, or at least just check and test if X is well understood or not. Of course, if it's like a light box and an image shows up, you probably don't need it, right? But then if you have something relates to filters, to avoid the situations, it might be perfectly fine to just make it, to kind of make it very, very clear what it is and what it isn't, right? That might be helping everyone at this point. If you want to learn a little bit more about this, of course, you will find a lot of resources around neurodiversity in general. Here, Neurodiversity Design System, a fantastic resource to get started. And also we'll find quite a few things on all of that also in designing for users on the autistic spectrum. There's quite a lot of detail on that there too. We are not done yet, everyone, but we are close. So when I look at what we have here, and I want to kind of leave enough time for your questions, there is just maybe one more significant topic that I want to bring on, and the rest will come a little bit later. Because I also was going to write an article about this anyway, right? But there's maybe just because I know it's been long now, and I want to jump into your questions, I want to kind of really dive in into like looking at all the things and design patterns that we could be applying for different situations. In general, it's all about clarity. Now, for me, again, the most important thing is to make it very, very difficult for people to make mistakes, right? Make it very, very difficult for people to make mistakes. But also, that might not be enough because we need to make a strong case for accessibility. So I need to just, there's like 5 more minutes and then I'll jump into all the questions that you have. Because when I think about explaining accessibility, and I mean, I know that you are in this very call because you care, right? And we have I don't know, like 1,000+ incredible people in the school who really do care. And that's fantastic. But how do we actually sell it, right? If we need to sell it. Well, first of all, I always get reminded of this wonderful article by H. Locke, in which he said, well, whenever you're trying to do anything in your work, be it UX research without access to users or anything else, really, what you always try to do is to shed some light on the truth. If you don't have access to users to do accessibility testing, you can actually explain that, okay, maybe you could do some desk research, maybe you can look into some data, maybe you could do some proxy testing, maybe you could do some real-world observations. The more you shed the light on the truth, the more truth comes to light. And I love that. And so what I try to do every single time is to actually really make it very, very obvious what accessibility means. And I don't mean it from a technical perspective, but instead I just create video clips. And usually I would be starting with simple usability tests, very simple things where I would actually clip video recordings of people struggling or not struggling with a particular product that we're dealing. But I really failed so many times by arguing about facts and charts and legal compliance and concerns and anything like that. It's just not something that people can relate to. But you know what people can relate to? Everybody has a neighbor, a friend, a colleague, or relative who has either ADHD or autism or dyslexia or something similar. You always have somebody who has problem identifying and reading letters or characters or numbers. People who struggle with copy paste, people who struggle with forgetting things. Like there are always those cases. So what I try to present every time, you just make it very clear that accessibility is not a technical term, and that we're basically just looking about creating a better experience for people who tend to be our users. I don't see, and I haven't discovered yet, a single product manager who just didn't care about accessibility of the users. I mean, they just don't know what it means. Because in many ways, to me, in my book, when I present it, it's not accessibility. It's just good UX. It's just good design. It's very similar to like good performance, right? This is just a part of a good experience. Experience is everything. It's accessibility, it's performance, it's security, it's privacy, it's inclusiveness, it's being respectful, it's being kind, it's being supportive, it's getting people loyal and trustworthy and kind of being respectful towards them. And that's kind of a part of it. So this is what my goal is. And I always try to proxy accessibility through the lens of user research, right? And the way for me to do that here is to basically say, okay, can we just bring in a few people with disabilities for testing? You know, just 3, 4, 5, not much, just to see what the experience is like. Most of the time, the experience is disastrous. That's more than enough. I never ask for big commitments, right? Very small commitments, maybe 2 sessions, 3 sessions for the next 2, 3 months and see how it goes. Of course, we can always explain the high cost of retrofitting accessibility. But very often, we also need to be prepared about objections about cost, competition, and slowdowns. And I think in many ways, this is kind of my toolkit. So there is always a conversation about accessibility is expensive. It isn't when we actually start working on it. It is not, right? It isn't really. It will be expensive once you have to retrofit it. Oh, yes, right? There's also, again, I was working with a fintech company, and I mean, oh my God, like if you improve accessibility for older adults, these are the people who have the capital. These are probably the only people in the world who still have capital at this point. And you're just abandoning this incredibly huge 1 billion people just because you don't care? What a ridiculous, stupid business case that is, right? This is just ridiculous. How can you be like, this is just weird. There is a big like audience waiting for you right there. So you can always kind of try to create an argument like that. And we always try to create a very simple and very tangible accessibility roadmap with actions, timelines, roles, and goals, right? And maybe establish regular testing. And this is what I always try to use. So this is kind of my, I also wrote an article about this, which goes into all the fine detail. When accessibility is an edge case, we can't really invest in it at this point of time. Let's move into the next sprint. And I kind of go through examples of why not. Accessibility, we don't have any disabled users. Why bother? Well, I have a template for that, right? And you will find a lot of those things, by the way, in the article that I published. I'm just going to drop it in a moment. How to make a strong case for accessibility. I think it's maybe even this one. Check, yes, I think like that. There's a lot of templates right there that you can actually go ahead and use right away if this question comes up, right? And again, remember, in the very beginning, I showed you this. And I always bring it up as an example to show what we actually can do and how to make it work. And if you want to see a very nice detailed case study about how to build accessibility research practices from scratch, from nothing, there's a wonderful, relatively long case study by Maya on Medium about building accessibility research practices in general, right? And I mean, the only thing is, again, I'm not trying to argue about legal or compliance or something similar, but I'm actually arguing specifically about, people who that person that I'm arguing with knows, right? Because again, accessibility is not necessarily for people with disabilities alone. I mean, technically it is, but when we're designing for accessibility or with inclusive design, that's just a different world altogether. It does not relate specifically to technical implementation alone, but also many other things that need to be considered, right? So there is that. All right, so I hope there was some usefulness in there as well. To wrap up this part over here, my dear friends, and then I could jump to your questions. I hope there were some useful bits for you, for everyone in here. Thank you so much for staying, and also wonderful people on the chat in Zoom. I want to remind everyone, we have this wonderful Smart Interface Design Patterns course. There is another one that I have recorded, and it will be coming in probably around something like I think 2 weeks from now at latest. So it will be all around measuring UX. And I'm also going to record another full workshop, like 10 hours or so on accessibility and inclusive design. So that's coming up as well. So if you want to follow along, feel free to take a screenshot. Probably going to drop in a link to it as well. About this, I'm just going to drop a link here, just in case you're wondering. Here we go, code inclusive, right here. And I want to leave you with just one little video, which is kind of a story of my life, and I think it's a story of your life as well. It's very short, and then we'll jump in right in questions right away, right? So welcome to our world. Probably that's your world as well. And sometimes things just don't launch at all. Huge thanks to Parallel Studio for the wonderful video. With this come cats. And I just want to remind ourselves in the end, every single person is different and it's very, very unique, right? And everybody will experiencing in one way or the other some sort of disability, be it temporary, be it situational, be it permanent, be it, related to the product or not, right? It's not necessarily about creating like specifically covering that edge case or that specific use case and make sure that it's checked. It's not about compliance either. There is one final thing that I really wish we've done more often, because I mean, I didn't jump into this because we just didn't have enough time to go through all the sections, but there is this wonderful, wonderful work that's been done around AUS usability scale. And this is exactly what I want to see more of. Now, what it actually is, very similar to SUS, System Usability Scale for Usability, we can actually measure usability of a product. What it does is it measures the usability of accessibility. And the idea behind this is it's not just about, again, compliance, checking checkboxes and making sure that we are fully WCAG compliant or whatever. No, what AUS does is you give people tasks, like something like 10 to 12 tasks to complete. Find this piece of information on the site. Import this file or export that file, whatever. You just give people tasks. And then after they did that with a screen reader software or whatever, depending on what type of disability they might have, you give them this little survey what they tell you, and again, this is where you can find like what type of technology did you use, maybe voice over, on what kind of device, maybe on, mobile, which browser, probably, maybe on Safari here, right? And then they have to answer 10 questions, right? And this is where we measure how usable that accessible experience was, right? And then you get a score out of that. And so it's not just, compliance, we got, okay, done 100% compliance, but we measure how usable that product is. Because if something is compliant, it doesn't mean that it's actually still usable, especially when you keep repeating the same thing for a screen reader user and stuff like that, just because of improper markup and so on. And I wish more of that. Not only for people who use screen reader, but in general to measure how accessible our product is as well. So this is going to be another area that I'm going to explore in a bit more detail probably after this, but I hope that some insights that we have covered, that we've been looking at today, will help us at least move to the right direction. I'm actually quite hopeful, really am. I think that we need some sort of legislation which will probably make a lot of products more accessible, and that's a good thing. I'm actually really impressed by how far we've come already, actually, although the fact that we still have so many accessibility problems is a bit disappointing and very, very sad. But I'm actually quite hopeful that we are moving in the right direction nevertheless. So that's, I think, me. From my end, if you have joined and you just wanted to make sure that you actually cover all the content, that's it. I'll be happy to jump right into questions right away to see how we're doing and where we currently are here. I hope, oh my God, there is a lot of questions. Well, I better start, I would say. And just in case you need to leave, thank you so much for coming, everyone. I'm looking forward to see you again anytime soon. Maybe at SmashingCon one day. All right, let's see what we've got. First question that came very quickly regarding interactive states. Hover, active, current, disabled, etc. How to determine if it's an essential state and therefore must meet all of the WCAG criteria? How do you know if it's an essential state? For example, if hover is an essential state and therefore buttons hover color must have a frequent color contrast that gets the page background. Well, for me, I would say indeed, like 3 to 1 would be minimum anyway. So I'd probably try to get to that point where it's all just accessible. Hover on its own is problematic, right? So we cannot rely on hover alone. It must be, we must support tap and click anyway, or at least open with a keyboard as well. So that, frankly, I don't know. So maybe somebody on the call knows, but here it might be a bit too technical for me, I have to admit. From my end, I would say that I would treat hover exactly the same way as everything else. I would probably not reduce the contrast because I can. Okay. Okay, while there is an answer being written, I'm going to kind of proceed to the next one. Regarding high contrast mode, is it enough to display links? It's just the link color, or is it better applying for the CSS styles when hovering that link? I think from what I know, when we were implementing hover, hover is not mandated. You don't need necessarily hover state to be present in the first place. It of course can be helpful. As of high contrast mode, I don't know if this is enough to display links in link color, or it needs something else. I mean, as long as you have a high enough contrast, you should probably be fine. I would be I don't think that you need to have more styles just for the sake of it. That doesn't need to look different. As long as I mean, ideally, again, every link would be underlined anyway, but I don't think you need anything else on hover necessarily. This is not mandated. I think only disabled state is included from WCAG AA guidelines. It could be. Could be. All right. What's the most appropriate certification? Okay, here we go. Thank you so much for answering that question already. Have examples of a drag and drop list for reordering items that is compliant? Yeah, pretty much this is the one that I was showing. If you're looking for an example, I mean, I've been so impressed and I was so sad when Goldman Sachs design system was closed. It's not available publicly anymore. However, what you do find is they still have all of the incredible work that the team has been putting together here on Figma, right? And they have a lot of stuff around really complex data grids and dashboards and everything, and charts and data visualization, and also drag and drop. That's seriously impressive. There is also another one that is actually quite impressive, which is coming from specifically for healthcare. I think it's General Electric's healthcare design system. Yeah, this one. Let's see if it's, yes, at least this is public. It's also very, very complicated. This is just incredibly detailed. It's mostly images and just screenshots and stuff. But oh my God, this is really, really good, especially for medical healthcare application. This is one of the few, I think, healthcare design systems available out there. That's seriously impressive. And you can find quite a lot of stuff around accessible drag and drop there too. All right. But that's, oh my God, this is unbelievable. It's so good. Right. Okay. Moving along here. Can you provide the slides and other tools inside our department? Yes, sure, no problem. It's just, frankly, I'm just running out of storage on Google Drive, but I will clean it up and I will add the link for you there. No problem. We'll send it to you via email. By the way, everyone, just in case, obviously, we'll also add the video recording over here, along with the new link to the Google Drive or something else where you can download the slides. Is having content on the web versus downloading as a PDF better for accessibility? Oh my God. One of the main things that we're trying to do with the European Parliament is to get rid of PDFs as soon as we can, as far as we can. PDFs are breaking everything. They're heavy. They're very often very difficult to navigate because you can search within them, but it's not nice and it's just really bulky. And if you can have content on the web instead of PDF, I would always go with content. Can you share an example of taking PDF materials and bringing them to web HTML for accessibility? I would need to look into NDA, but I can probably show you, well, HTML CSS, I'm not sure. Maybe if you drop me an email, because also you will find my email here all the way down, by the way, dear friends, all the way down here, you will find my email address. So if you want to, or LinkedIn as well. So feel free to drop me and I can probably create a quick sketch for you to see what it's like. Oh, not sure about HTML, CSS, if I can still have access to it. In the yeah, totally. That's absolutely, that's also kind of important. By the way, there is a special standard around PDF, which is called, I think, PDF X or something for accessibility. So whenever you're exporting files into a PDF, you can make them more accessible, but still PDF on its own is, yeah. As a part of the wonderful work in the European Parliament, obviously PDFs also must be accessible there. Do you think accessibility settings is a lazy categorization for other anti-categorized things similar to advanced settings? Should we strive to do better than that? Yes, I would say that accessibility settings on its own is a very confusing part because I cannot kind of understand that people who are looking, let's say, for magnifying or zoom or, removing animation, stuff like that, they'll probably will be finding those things easier or faster. But on the other hand, shouldn't be just part of, if we're looking at something like zooming, part of display settings, maybe, right? I would probably agree more than disagree, if I'm being honest. That's a great question over here. I would try to do kind of break down and kind of add those features right on level when they actually are used. Right? What's an accessibility overlay? This would be things like that, indeed. There are plenty of overlays, which often make the accessibility of a product actually inaccessible, that may actually make it worse. There are a lot of challenges. In fact, there is overlay fact sheet or something that actually explains some of the issues that overlays have. I'm going to drop it in here. So I would probably say, probably kind of look into this as well. I also tend to publish quite a bit of stuff on LinkedIn, just in case anybody's interested. And I published a little piece on that. Let's see if we can find it. Why overall accessibility overlays are not a good idea. So maybe feel free to take a look in here. I'm also going to drop a link over here to check without UTM source. Here we go. Okay. It's quite clear about the commitment in making accessible e-banking websites and apps for retail customers, but does the EA apply to business banking as well? Yes. So whenever you're dealing with anything that actually communicates with customers within the European Union, be it banking, and I assume that this is online banking as well, then absolutely, definitely applies. That's a big capital letters yes. Is there any percentage or number of bank ATMs that need to be accessible to comply? For example, if a bank has 25% of ATMs only across the country, that's sufficient? Well, here's the story, right? Because if you don't touch a product or a system, then you will have another 5 years from what I know to be able to fix it. So unless you actually upgrade it and update it all the time, well, then you probably will need to be complying. But again, this is a question about how many people are affected by that. And if it's like a big enough challenge, I would say, or big enough, not a big enough problem for large majority of people who rely as your clients. If these are your customers that live in the European Union, whether you are a private company in the US, in Canada, outside of Europe, or within Europe, you have to comply with EAA. I don't think that there is a certain percentage of threshold, to be honest. So yeah. And when we talk about ATM's accessibility, of course, it's about the physical buttons, but also the software on its own, right? So yes. So EAA is for B2C, but not so much B2B. That is correct. However, again, if you are dealing with specific again, with specific companies that relying on your software, and there is at least one person who has special disability needs, then it will be your responsibility to actually meet their needs for that client. That actually falls under the umbrella of EAA. That article or that video that I highlighted earlier kind of covers that in a lot of detail. I can maybe just drop a link to this just so you can actually explore it in a bit more detail. Here, let me just check. That one by DQ is a fantastic little webinar on just that. Right, so here we go. Oops, that's a bit big. All right, great. Okay. Is there a way to know? I think that would be sort of something that we would need to ask a legal counsel. It's very difficult for me to answer that question, to be honest. Regarding AA, what if partners fail compliance? That's your responsibility to check, right? So that's also important. That also mentioned in this video. So if your product fails EAA because the partner that you're relying on fails EAA, that's also your responsibility to check and do due diligence, right? However, if they keep failing later, once you actually highlighted it and brought this to their attention, then it's difficult. I mean, this will be probably a legal debate that will be happening later, if in case you get in trouble, which I hope you will not, right? The EAA indeed references WCAG 2.1. However, I believe, and I might be wrong on that, that European Accessibility Act refers to the actual up-to-date standard that is aligned to the requirements of Web Accessibility Directive, which was served for public sector. So I believe, from what I know, that it actually relates to 2.2, but you might be right on that. Again, this is something that we might want to be kind of exploring a little bit more. Okay, let me just double check more questions. Okay, we have a lot here. No worries, no worries. Let's see how far we'll come. Work for gaming industry. Do you have any suggestions for reducing flashy graphics in third-party games? Would these games be subject to regulation? I don't know for sure, to be honest. It's again kind of another story over here about EAA. But when it comes to flashy, what you need to provide as a minimum is the ability to reduce animation, to reduce, kind of have reduced motion. Maybe turn them off with a button or something similar, or a setting in a product. The penalties are the same as with GDPR. It's actually quite heavy. So I think we're looking at something like 2 million again. No, at 10% or something, 10% of turnover or something similar. But I'm not sure how much it is. But it's similar to, it's quite heavy compared to what we've been experiencing to GDPR. It's very similar. Oh yeah, here we go. So there's an answer right there. Is there a recommendable tool for testing set of color palettes against simulated color with color blindness? Yes, there is. When you look at some parts that I was highlighting over here for color blindness, you will find who can use. I love who can use. I'm going to drop it in the chat as well. Who can use gives you a very nice simulator. So you can see how people with different color blindness or color weakness can actually experience your website. I kind of like it a lot. That's very, very nice. Over here. But there are also like all these other tools that I'm actually highlighting there. They actually provide something similar as well. Piece of software that is fully compliant. Ooh, I wouldn't know right now, to be honest. Good question. Sorry about that. What about email accessibility? How would you look at it? This is interesting because right now we're living in very interesting times of HTML accessibility, of HTML email, where we're moving towards standards complying email, moving away from these horrible tables and everything. So we should be very hopeful. And I think that even already now, unless you need to support an older version of Outlook, you can actually rely on and use divs. You don't need to use tables anymore. But of course, because of like, again, all the devices and all the clients, we might not be there. But if you're interested in HTML email, we have actually we have a workshop just on that, which goes into all the fine details of that, which I think is actually quite nice. Really, why we don't need tables anymore and how we can deal with them. There are also, if you actually look around, you will find quite a few interesting learnings or insights about HTML email and what has been happening. Highly recommend you to dive into it. It's very nice. Tips for keeping color blindness in mind when designing around the brand with set colors. What if your brand's main color is an accessible red? How to do work around knowing that color can change? Well, I think it's okay if you have, let's say, any color being a brand color. We just need to find the combination that works with it. Because again, the color contrast and accessibility comes into play when we have a foreground color, background color, a border, and basically the context around it, like icons and whatnot, is something similar. So all of this together must work. But I think that if you have a very dull yellow, that would be, of course, difficult. Then still you can put a dark enough brown color or something on it, and that would kind of be accessible. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're looking for combinations again, what you find is this wonderful tool called Contrast Grid, which allows you to bring in your main brand colors right here. Again, I'm going to drop it in the chat right there, and then check how well you're performing. There is also something like brand colors, brand colors, accessibility. Here we go, this one. Accessible brand colors. You bring in your brand colors and give you suggestions what you can use, right? Very nice. I'm going to add it over here. Brand colors. So just a second, let me see if I can find it. Here we go. Brand, accessible brand colors. By the way, dear friends, what I haven't covered today was deafness and screen reader use. So I can only encourage you to take a look at something that I've been putting together here. Just a second, design patterns for almost done. Just a second. So that would be this one. This is me searching for things all the time. So you'll find quite a few things around accessibility. No, not here. Oh, here we go. This one. This is the one around accessibility over here, and not only accessibility. So I'm going to drop it in the chat for you to use right here. So that's like a lot of stuff around accessibility, autism, dyscalculia, dyslexia, eligibility, LGBTQI, all the adult screen readers, and a lot of other stuff as well. Okay, let's keep going. What is the best option for creating accessible cookie pop-ups and banners? Ideally, this is what I also read an article about this. This was interesting because one thing that you might want to consider is that when you actually have a cookie pop-up, it can also be respectful. And what I mean by that is this is something that we try to implement. It's not right straight in your face, so it's there floating, right? But it's not blocking the entire screen. So that's kind of okay. Again, of course, at the same time, what you need to make sure that it's actually accessible, that people can actually focus on it, right? Here, and dismiss it as well, like from here. So that's an important part about cookie pop-up in general, or GDPR in general. That is blocking content, right? Indeed. So when you look again at focus requirements, success criteria, what we need to make sure that as you are tabbing through, right, that you actually make sure that the window view is not blocked by that pop-up, right? So it must be floating above it, so to say. But in general, yeah, that's probably the best thing you can do, I'm afraid. Oh, I'll just close this thing over here. Okay, keep going. Let's keep going here. Thank you so much, everyone, for answering the questions, by the way. I sincerely appreciate that. Okay, so that was that one. How do people who get motion sickness from a parallax effect watch a movie or play a video game? Oh, that depends because again, sometimes in some scenarios you can actually turn it off. And sometimes it's not as bad as parallax is. I mean, that depends. It can also kind of, depending on the location that you choose, it might be more or less strongly expressed. The micro animations can need to be fixed too. There are different thoughts on that. Sometimes if it's like a very small micro interaction, which is not disruptive, you don't need to turn it off just because somebody prefers reduced motion. For parallax, for sure, but typically when it comes to simple interface animations, like maybe card deck showing up and down or accordion, you don't necessarily need to. That's not needed. However, if it's abrupt, if it's very fast, or it's pushing the content up and down, then you might want to remove it. Understand how to consider universal design when beginning a new project, but do you have suggestions on where to begin for existing experiences? Well, I always try to start with the same thing. I have a very strategic approach. My goal is, and I always say that, but I really mean it. My goal is not to fail. What I mean by that is before I start working on anything, before I start asking for more commitment for accessibility or usability or anything similar, I try to make sure that I gain trust, because when I work in a big company, very often there is very little trust that I have. And so what I try to do is create a first pilot project where I try to find a problem that many people are speaking about or that many teams are aware of and try to fix that. So in that case, when I'm trying to make things more accessible, I would try to see if there is anything that actually blocks people, everyone, right? Not just, people who maybe, I don't know, like in a specific unit, but something that would be affecting everyone. Very typically, what you can find is that it's a very like simple things, like very small font size, right? It could also be something like a button that doesn't say what it's supposed to say, that people accidentally click, right? Anything like that to build up a strong case first. And then once I'm getting that and I kind of demonstrate impact, even although it's quite small, ask for a little bit more and more and more. And so as time passes by, I basically start working on more and more things, but always from kind of small steps first. I never ask for big commitments. And also, related to that, when it comes to, let's say, conversation in a big meeting, I always try to make sure that everybody who needs to be able to have a say about the new design or new adjustments, changes, will be heard or listened, meaning I set up a one-to-one call with stakeholders to present early design or late design, final design or non-final design to them and get their feedback. And the reason why I do that is because I don't want to have this big snowball effect when somebody hates the design in a big meeting when it's finally revealed. It's kind of building up confidence from every individual stakeholder. So when then actually the meeting happens, everybody will have had the major key players will have had a chance to actually see it and give feedback, right? So that would be my starting point there. I think, dear friends, I think I'm going to limit to another 10 minutes because we can literally do this forever. And I'll be happy to, probably not be able to answer all of your questions, but thank you so much for all your interest in here. All right. Swipe down gesture on the sheet component sufficient, or should there also be a close button? Well, I'm one of those people who would say almost always, you know what? I don't mind redundancy as long as people need it. If our redundancy helps people prevent mistakes from happening, that's a good thing. So I would say, why actually have X if you can have a close button? Okay, maybe I'm boring like that, but the more obvious, the better. Notifications, live region, and the close button. Again, I'm not necessarily like a front-end accessibility expert at this point. I'm just trying to do the best from the UX perspective. If we use a live region for notifications, there shouldn't be any interactive elements inside, so no close button. But if notification disappears after 500 milliseconds, which is a problem on its own, right? If it's a toast message, I guess, it can be hard to access for non-screen reader users. So if we use the close button for notification, we should move focus instead of using live regions. Oh, wow, I'm really not I think a technical person to answer that, I'm afraid. But in general, what we have been spotting is that whenever it comes to notifications, it might also be like we have error summary for errors. It might be a good idea to have like a notification summary somewhere available as well. So even if they disappear, they can also be recoverable. Maybe something like that could help. On the other hand, in general, if we have disappearing notifications, That depends, because again, if you have, let's say, user interacting with something, and then all of a sudden the live region kicks in, and you need to convey notification content, then again, that would probably create some problem with the focus. But I think I'm not quite sure if I can answer that question specifically, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. Keith, thank you so much for answering the question about the color contrast. I appreciate that. I'm just going to jump to another file because I know that there are a lot of people asking there as well. Okay, or is it the same? I think it's different, right? Oh, wow. Thank you so much, everyone, for bringing this in here. Or is it the same? I think it's the same. Oh, hold on. This is another one. Wait, is it the copy? I'm just going to double check here. So that's the copy right here. Okay, these are just takeaways, and this is again the question. Okay. Again, it's kind of the same story. Public schools actually had to comply with WCAG 2.1 for many, many years now because of the what was that? I think it was called the, hold on, I have it here, Web Accessibility Directive. So public sector had to meet WCAG 2.1 forever. I mean, for like 7 or 8 years now, actually. Regarding color contrast, is it better to use APCA, or is WCAG 2.2 already up to date enough to rely on? Well, I think what I always reminded of when I think about color contrast is maybe when we're actually defining colors, to not use HSL, but use actually LCH. So I'm going to bring this in here, which is also widely supported in browsers at this point, which kind of goes in this direction without necessarily explicitly relying on using APCA. Although, again, it's still early days, it might change, but this little tool here that I also linked in the Google Doc helps you get to a really good place, which actually accounts already for APCA right here. So you can see this in action. But most importantly for me, it just generates color scales that are applicable right away and you can use right away as well. So you don't have this dark yellow problem, for example, that we had for many, many years. Right? Okay, so let me just check because I think I'm losing track between, oh, no, here we go. I think this is the one. Okay. Yeah, Leonardo color is also decent. I mean, there are so many tools, so there is no harm in that. How to make passwords accessible? Very easy without using passkeys, because passkeys is also not exactly for elderly. Yes, so the best thing you can do with passwords is always include show and hide for password, like a button, show, hide password. That's one thing. The other thing, so, okay, I'm going to be very difficult at this point, but I would say when we're dealing with passwords, you don't need ridiculously strong passwords that are 16 characters long and lowercase, uppercase, exclamation mark, emoji, and whatever, glyphs and whatever. Most people, again, still around 60-65% of people will try to reuse the same password. And if it doesn't work, they will try to complete their password with something that will match. And they will forget it the moment they actually finished signing up. And if they actually cannot remember, and they have to remember because they have to type it in, what they're going to do is put it on a sticky note right here in front of them, and then it makes it not very secure either, right? So typically, it seems to be perfectly reasonable to go with at least 8, maybe 12 characters, lowercase, uppercase, and I think digits. And actually encouraging people to maybe use 4 random words instead of using weird combinations they cannot remember is probably a bit better. But in that case, this is probably the best we can do. Actually, you know, the faster you can encourage people to move to password managers if they can by supporting it with this new password, autocomplete new password in HTML, the better. When you do research, how do you, Vitaly, make sure you have the relevant cognitive impairments covered? Oh, that's a good point. There is a service that allows you to find people who have cognitive impairments. There are a few options that we've been considering. First of all, I mean, I know it sounds very ridiculous, but you can ask your colleagues if they know somebody, right? Okay, that might not be a target audience. That's fair. Second, there are always companies, organizations, or foundations, or nonprofits in every city, larger city, which basically will give you access to people who maybe have relevant cognitive impairments or disabilities. So you can always reach out to them. There might also be communities of people who are willing to support you and actually find people for you. You might need to spend a bit of money in this case, of course, because you will have to bring people in that probably will require transportation potentially and anything else. And any sort of honorarium is, of course, welcome and very much needed. That would be very important as well. So that could help. There was a page which allows you to do something like usertesting.com, but for people with disabilities. I would need to find it. If you send me an email, I'll try to do my best to find it. What to do instead of sending verification codes for dyscalculia? Well, maybe, although it's not the securest way, magic sign and link would be fine, right? In that case. I mean, if you have Google Authenticator or something similar, then there is a verification code, of course. But even then, if it's on a mobile device, you just need to read it out so you can, a person who is using that device can just paste it in, right? That's also better, right? Is it difficult for deaf people to follow websites because they have their own sign language? Normal texts are not that helpful. There has to be easy language to interpreters in the background. How are so many websites supposed to achieve the goal of being barrier-free for them? There's a lot to do and a lot that cannot be done. Yes, so indeed, as some of you might know, of course, there is no universal language for people who happen to be deaf. It's like, for example, a person who is deaf in the UK, who is deaf in the US, will not be able to speak the same language in terms of sign language. So that's always an issue. I mean, there are different ways to improve subtitles and captioning. Right, we're getting somewhere. There are kind of a few interesting directions that are being explored there to add some visual elements to subtitles. Right now, we have just text to change the shift and position of who is speaking, how they're speaking, maybe things like that. Most organizations don't have the money or resources to hire interpreters in different languages potentially as well to help there. So I would say the best thing you can do at this point, and I think I have an article on this too, by the way. But, I take these notes, but I always forget in the end here. So I'm going to drop it in the chat, in the Google Doc here too. Right? There are some pointers of things to keep in mind in general, but this all mostly relates to transcripts, search within transcripts, and also captioning. Okay, maybe 3 more questions if I may, everyone. I need to eat. Other special considerations for looking into inclusivity issues with children and youth, methodologies, recruitment, etc. Oh, first of all, what I have to say is that there are no better user testers for usability testing than teenagers. Oh my God, teenagers will tell you everything. If you can, I don't know if you may, legally? You please go ahead and hire teenagers. They will be the most critical, the most honest, and the most helpful people you can find. There is that. I'm not sure if it's actually legal to hire teenagers. I don't know, whatever. So there is that. On the other hand, when I think about children and youth, there is of course, a lot of legal concerns. Obviously, this will be requiring you to ask for parental green light at this case. As of methodologies recruitment, again, when it comes to teenagers, that's pretty much the same as regular usability testing. You just need to be very careful because I think the most important thing with teenagers, and I mean, I don't have a teenager yet, but the most important thing would be to not treat them like children, but treat them like young adults. And there is a difference of how you speak with them and how you talk to them, right? So you need to kind of look into age appropriate speaking and content and what they're being presented, things like that. On the other hand, when it comes to, again, recruitment, I don't know. I don't know of any service that actually has anything that would be helpful there. I mean, you know what I learned in a way that even if you have somebody who is not necessarily a big expert in the domain, but they can still help by giving you the insight as long as they kind of tangentially, like remotely related to what you have. Like one of the things if we don't have any access to users is to say, you know what, can we just find people who are on the team but not necessarily involved in that product or in that project we're working on, but understand the domain. So that would be probably the most useful thing ever. I'm not sure if it helps, but thank you so much for the question. Resource recommendations for building a new accessibility department. Oh my God, this wonderful article by Booking again is absolutely incredible. How to build accessibility research and basically accessibility practice in general. Fantastic. And it all starts with this little exercise, little kind of brainstorming that I actually showed in the very beginning, right? Highly recommended. I'm going to drop it in here. Really, really great stuff right here. Also, by the way, just in case, there is also Universal Design Guide, which is a playbook for universal design with a lot of methods for design to basically do your regular design work, but also always looking at it through the lens of accessibility. It's actually just great stuff for UX or any UX work right here. I think it's also mentioned in the Google Doc. So you can just go ahead and use it. It's really fantastic. But it always looks at anything from facilitation and any kind of activities, UX activities through the lens of accessibility and inclusive design. So that's great. Okay, two more. I was researching a news website where, due to the cancellation of the physical newspaper, more elderly users became visitors to the site. Do you have any tips for making the website more accessible for this age group without disrupting the experience for younger users? Well, frankly, I think that one contradicts the other. So if you can, I mean, I would probably say, you know what, let's do this. Let me show you here, just a second. Where was I? Where did I have it? There's a wonderful piece by Oliver Schundorfer. I think he also happens to be here in the room about font sizes. Font size. Oh, here we go. This one right here. So if we look at the size of text, I would probably just go ahead and just improve the font size just right away. I also have a piece about golden rules, whatever, on LinkedIn again. Sorry about promoting LinkedIn all the time, but I just found it very useful. That's the one where you find that kind of recommendations about what should be the font sizes for desktop and on mobile, for body text, for display text, and so on. That would be the best thing ever. This is the best thing you can do. Just improve text and legibility. That's what I would start and do as much as I can on mobile and on desktop. Right, okay, and I think one more, there was one more here, I believe. Let me just check, or maybe I just closed the window. That's very disappointing. Oh yeah, here we go. That's the one. All right. Oh, well, accessibility guidelines that may compromise security. For example, we disable copy paste in forms to prevent spam submissions. There are different ways to track spam. There is a honeypot pattern that might not work or might work for you. I mean, of course, you can try to still use invisible captcha. From what I know, this is reCAPTCHA free from Google. From what I understood, it's actually compliant with EAA and accessible because most of the time people will not see it. I think they're also working on something to change these fire hydrants and stuff like that into something that's more accessible. I think it's puzzles at this point or whatnot. You can take a look. So that might be okay. But ideally, like also something like honeypot technique, where you basically create an empty field, and then most spam bots will actually try to fill it in because it just looks like a text bot, like input field, but that would be kind of a honeypot where you basically attract them. Just a small yes/no question to finish the session. Is EAA also applicable for internal applications? I think, again, it's the same story like with B2B. I think what you will get is if you have somebody who is using an internal application but has any kind of disability that requires you to support keyboard or anything else and cannot do their work because of your product or your software being inaccessible, then you might be asked and you might be legally obliged to improve accessibility of your product. This is my understanding, at least, of EAA. So while many people would say that doesn't apply to B2B, doesn't apply to internal tools, again, if it's not the case, then you'll be okay. If you have a case like that, then you will have a conversation about that for sure. Right. Whew. All right, everyone. I think it was indeed 3.5 hours. And oh my God, I'm still so impressed that there are still 283 amazing people here and also probably some in YouTube. Well, thank you so much for joining, everyone. As I mentioned, we also will include the video recording right here. You don't need to copy paste everything. All of this stuff is going to stay. The slides I'm going to upload to Google Drive. Feel free to use these resources as much as you need. Let's be friends on LinkedIn and everywhere else. And thank you so much, everyone. I think that we'll probably announce a new free session at some point next year, early next year, maybe. Thank you so much, everyone. You are amazing in every possible way.
Thank you, Vitaly.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Dinner it is indeed.
Thank you very much.
This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Karina. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Of course, my pleasure. And then the number was dropping and dropping and dropping. All right, Jan, are you still around? Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Did you learn something, Jan?
Lots.
Okay. Amanda's also still around. Amanda
Oh,
also?
we're all here.
Okay, fantastic. Excellent. Well, I think I'm going to get some dinner now.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for staying around. Everything worked on YouTube as well?
All good.
Excellent. All right. Happy to hear that. Fantastic. So wonderful. Thank you so much, Yoram, as well. I'll actually definitely diving into the topic, so I sincerely appreciate your input. And please do let me know if you have like a list of things that I should be keeping in mind to have to fix. I will. I want to get it right. All right. Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Talk to you very, very soon, everyone.
Have a nice evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and have a nice evening or morning or day, depending on which part of the world you're in. And we'll have the recording up ASAP, probably more likely tomorrow, like tomorrow morning, depending on how late we stay up. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.